In the climate-controlled vault of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, resting behind reinforced glass, sits a four-sided clay prism barely 8 inches tall. Its surface is covered entirely in cuneiform script, thousands of wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay nearly 4,000 years ago. The object is catalogued as AN 1923.444, though most scholars know it simply as the Weld Blundell prism. If you could hold it, you'd feel the weight of fired clay in your palm, cool and slightly rough. The incisions catch the light at angles, creating shadows within shadows. But there's something else you might feel, something the museum label doesn't mention. This small object contains a claim so extraordinary that we've spent a century trying to explain it away. Near the very top of the prism, where the scribe began his careful work, appear these words in Sumerian: after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not established, not claimed, not seized, descended. The conventional interpretation treats this as ancient propaganda, early kings claiming divine sanction to legitimize their rule. A metaphor, poetry, the sort of thing primitive people believed before they understood political philosophy. And yet the Sumerian scribes were remarkably precise in their language. They had different words for inheritance, conquest, appointment, and transfer of power. They chose descended with the same care a modern legal document chooses bequeath over give. What if we've been reading this wrong? What if the Sumerians weren't describing how kings claimed divinity, but rather documenting a specific procedure, a system for transferring cosmic authority that was already ancient when they first carved it into clay? Before you dismiss this as fringe speculation, consider what the texts themselves actually say, not what we assume they mean, not what fits our modern understanding of how civilizations develop. What they say, because the Sumerians left us something remarkable, not just stories about divine kingship, but what appear to be procedural manuals, instructions, protocols for maintaining something they believed had been entrusted to humanity from somewhere else, sometime before. Over the next hours, we're going to examine the evidence they left behind. Real tablets with catalogue numbers, excavated structures with measurable dimensions, linguistic patterns that don't quite fit our theories about political evolution. We'll present what mainstream scholarship says, and we'll explore what that scholarship struggles to explain. You'll hear the evidence. You decide what it means. If you're listening to this in the quiet hours, wherever you are in the world, drop a comment about your location and the time. There's something fitting about contemplating ancient mysteries while the modern world sleeps. The Sumerians believed certain knowledge was best transmitted in stillness. Let's begin where they began, not with the invention of kingship, but with its descent. When the sky touched earth, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers has been inhabited for over 10,000 years, but something changed there around 4500 BC. Villages that had existed for millennia began reorganizing themselves into something new. By 3500 BC, the world's first cities rose from the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia: Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash. These weren't just large settlements, they represented a fundamental reorganization of human society into something that hadn't existed before. Or had it? The Sumerians themselves would have disagreed with that chronology. According to their own records, everything important had already happened. The cities they built weren't innovations, they were reconstructions. The knowledge they possessed wasn't discovered, it was remembered. And kingship, that organising principle that would spread from Mesopotamia across the ancient world, didn't evolve from tribal chieftains. It came from somewhere else. The Weld Blundell prism, which we encountered in the vault, is the most complete version of a document known as the Sumerian King List. Multiple copies of this text have been found, suggesting it was considered important enough to reproduce and preserve across generations. The oldest fragments date to around 2100 BC, but the events they describe reach back thousands of years earlier into a time the Sumerians called before the flood. When you read the king list in translation, the opening section is jarring. It begins not with the founding of cities or the rise of agriculture, but with a simple declaration: kingship existed before anything else we would recognise as civilization. The text states this as fact, not myth. After kingship descended from heaven, it was first established in Eridu, the oldest city according to Sumerian tradition, sacred to the god Enki. Then come the names. Alulim ruled as king in Eridu, his reign 28,800 years. His successor Alalgar ruled 36,000 years. 8 kings in 5 cities before the flood, each reigning for tens of thousands of years. Then the flood swept over the land. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven once more, this time to Kish. Mainstream scholarship has several explanations for these impossible reign lengths. The numbers may be symbolic, representing not individual rulers, but dynasties or entire cultural periods. The Sumerian numerical system used large units: Sars 3600 year, Ners 600 year, Soses 60 years, which could indicate these weren't meant as literal historical records, but as mythological time. Some scholars suggest the antediluvian section was added later, a fictional prologue to give antiquity and divine sanction to historical kings. All of these interpretations are reasonable. They allow us to extract useful historical information from the post-flood kings whose reigns become more plausible, hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands. The text becomes a framework for Mesopotamian chronology, a king list like those found in other ancient cultures, embellished with mythology. But there's something these interpretations don't quite address. The Sumerians weren't careless with language. Throughout their vast cuneiform literature, administrative records, legal contracts, medical texts, mathematical calculations, they demonstrate remarkable precision. When they meant metaphor, they used poetic forms. When they meant literal counts, they used administrative notation. The king list uses the latter. More puzzling is the concept itself. The Sumerian term is Nam-Lugal, kingship as an essential principle, an office, a cosmic function. Not Lugal great man, the term for an individual king, but Nam-Lugal, the abstract principle of kingship itself. And it descended. The verb is specific, to come down from a higher place to a lower one. The same verb used when gods descend from their temples, when sacred objects are brought down from altar platforms. What if the Sumerians were recording something they believed had actually happened? Not the literal reign of individual kings for impossible spans, but the continuous operation of an institution, an office that had been established before the catastrophe they called the flood, and which was re-established afterward. Consider how the text treats this descent. There's no origin story for kingship itself, no explanation of how or why it was created. It simply exists, like a natural law, and it moves from place to place, from heaven to Eridu, then, after the flood, from heaven to Kish. Later passages describe how kingship was taken from one city and was brought to another, transferred like an office, not invented anew. This procedural language appears throughout Sumerian religious texts. The me, a concept we'll explore in depth shortly, are described the same way, not created by gods, but possessed by them, transferable, able to be stolen, gifted, or lost. When the goddess Inanna acquires the me from Enki in one famous myth, the text doesn't describe her inventing new powers. She obtains existing ones, already defined, already functional. If we take the Sumerian perspective seriously, even provisionally, we're looking at a radically different understanding of civilization's origins. Not a gradual evolution from simple to complex, from chieftain to king to god-king. Instead, a recovery, a restoration of something that had existed before, was lost in catastrophe, and was carefully reconstructed according to preserved knowledge. The text says the flood swept over the land. Then, without explanation, kingship descended again, not reinvented, not evolved from the survivors, descended, as though whatever source provided it originally was still operating, still able to transmit this cosmic function to Earth. Archaeological evidence confirms that something profound happened in Mesopotamia's development. The Ubaid period, 55-4000, shows gradual cultural development, pottery styles, settlement patterns, agricultural techniques. Then, suddenly, the Uruk period, 4300, explodes with innovations that appear nearly simultaneously: the wheel, the plough, monumental architecture, complex administration, and most significantly writing. These aren't incremental improvements. They represent a comprehensive system of civilization appearing in a remarkably short span. The standard explanation is that these innovations were interconnected. Success in agriculture created surplus, surplus enabled specialization, specialization led to cities, cities required administration, administration demanded record keeping. A logical chain, and yet the Sumerians, when they told their own story, described it differently. They said the me, the complete set of civilized arts and offices, already existed. They had been preserved. The work wasn't invention, it was remembering. The king list names Eridu as the first city to receive kingship. Archaeological excavations at Eridu, conducted in the 1940s and 1950s, revealed something extraordinary. The site contains the remains of 18 successive temples, built one atop another over thousands of years. The earliest, a small shrine from around 5000 BCE, is already sophisticated in design, oriented according to precise alignments, constructed with knowledge of materials and engineering. Each successor temple rebuilt in exactly the same orientation, following the same essential plan, just larger and more elaborate. This isn't trial and error. This is the execution of a template, repeated with increasing skill across millennia. As though the builders weren't figuring out how to construct sacred space, they were perfecting the realization of a pattern they already possessed. The temple at Eridu was dedicated to Enki, god of wisdom, fresh water and crafts, but the texts give him another title that's rarely emphasized: keeper of the me, not creator, keeper, guardian of something already in existence. When kingship descended to Eridu, according to the king list, it descended to Enki's city, the city of the keeper of cosmic knowledge. The text doesn't explain why kingship descended. It doesn't describe the mechanism. It simply records that it did, and that certain cities in a certain order became its vessels, as though documenting an observed phenomenon rather than explaining a belief system. After the flood, the text continues with post-Diluvian kings. Their reigns are still improbably long, hundreds or thousands of years, but they decrease gradually, approaching historically verifiable ranges. As the list progresses toward names we can confirm from other sources. Gilgamesh appears on the list, described as the 5th king of Uruk's first dynasty after the flood, ruling for 126 years. We found his name in administrative texts. He was a real king, ruling around 2700 BCE. The pattern suggests the earlier portions aren't pure fiction, but perhaps a different kind of record. What if those impossible reign lengths represent something other than individual human lifespans? What if they measure the duration that the office of kingship resided in a particular location, institutional continuity rather than biological longevity? This interpretation would explain the decreasing timescales. As cities became more politically unstable, as conflicts between city-states intensified, kingship, understood as legitimate cosmic authority, transferred more frequently. The office itself remained constant. Its vessels changed. The Sumerians developed sophisticated administrative systems to track everything: grain stores, labour hours, temple offerings, trade goods. They were accountants before they were poets. When they recorded kingship descending from heaven, they used the same sober archival tone they used for commodity receipts. What were they accounting for? The question sits there in the cuneiform, pressed into clay and fired hard, after the kingship descended from heaven. Not after kings claimed divine right, not after rulers declared themselves chosen by gods. After a thing that exists independently, Kingship itself, Namlugal, the cosmic office, moved from one realm to another. The Sumerians knew their texts would be read by future generations. They believed in the importance of accurate record keeping for continuity across time. When they placed this claim at the very beginning of their most important historical document, they were establishing the foundation for everything that followed, everything they built, everything they preserved, everything they carefully transmitted to successor cultures that would carry forward the concept of divine kingship. Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, and eventually every kingdom that claimed cosmic sanction for earthly rule, all tracing back to that moment recorded on the Weld Blundell Prism, when something called kingship came down from somewhere called heaven, and the history they knew how to measure began. The keeper's burden. The Sumerian language operates differently from English. It's an agglutinative language, building meaning through the combination of separate meaningful elements rather than inflection. This linguistic structure reveals how the Sumerians categorized their world, including the concept at the heart of our investigation. When we translate Lugal from cuneiform, we render it as king. The term literally means great man. Lu plus gal. It refers to an individual holding a position, a person. But the texts that discuss kingship's descent from heaven don't use this term. They use Namlugal. The prefix Nam is critical. It transforms a word from describing a person into describing an abstract principle or essential quality. Namlugal isn't a king, it's kingship itself, the state or essence of being king, the office abstracted from any individual who might occupy it. This isn't a subtle distinction, it's fundamental to how the Sumerians understood authority. A Lugal could die. The Namlugal continued. A Lugal could be overthrown. The Namlugal could only be transferred. Multiple Lugals might claim power simultaneously. Only one could legitimately hold Namlugal at a given time. Dozens of tablets from various Sumerian cities contain variations on this phrase, kingship was taken from, or kingship was brought to. The verb choices are transactional, physical, not leadership shifted or power changed hands, which would suggest a natural political process. The language describes movement of a thing. In administrative texts, we see similar language used for sacred objects. The royal insignia, temple treasures, divine standards, these moved with care and ceremony. They could be captured, gifted or reclaimed. They carried authority independent of who currently possessed them. You didn't create a new throne of Enlil. You inherited the existing one, or you took it, or it was given to you. What if Namlugal operated the same way? What if the Sumerians understood kingship as something that existed independently, could be bestowed or withdrawn, and carried legitimacy through its origins rather than through human agreement? This would explain a puzzling pattern in Sumerian royal inscriptions. When kings describe their authority, they rarely claim to have seized power through their own strength or wisdom. Instead, they describe being chosen, called, or entrusted. King Gudea of Lagash, ruling around 2144-2124 BC, left numerous inscribed statues and cylinders. In every one, he frames his kingship not as achievement, but as assignment. The gods didn't make him powerful, so he could become king. They gave him kingship, and that gift made his actions legitimate. The Gudea cylinders, housed in the Louvre as AO3293 and AO3295, span over 1,400 lines of carefully inscribed text. They describe in extraordinary detail how Gudea came to build the Temple of Ningirsu. The narrative begins with divine instruction through dreams. Gudea doesn't decide to build a temple and ask for divine blessing. The decision originates in the divine realm. His role is to execute it properly. Cylinder A describes Gudea's uncertainty about the dream's meaning. He consults with the goddess Nanshi, who interprets the vision. The god Ningirsu has chosen Gudea to build his house, not because Gudea is powerful, not because he's wealthy, but because he has been selected for this function. Gudea's response isn't pride, it's anxiety about executing the task correctly. He asks repeatedly for specifications, measurements, proper materials. The text catalogues these requirements with technical precision: specific types of stone from specific locations, timber from distant mountains. The foundation must be laid according to exact procedures. The dimensions follow a revealed pattern. This isn't a king deciding to impress his people with monumental architecture. This is an administrator receiving a blueprint and working to implement it faithfully. What emerges from the Gudea cylinders is a portrait of kingship as function rather than status. Gudea possesses Nam Lugal, which means he has the authority and obligation to maintain the proper relationship between his city and the divine realm. Building the temple isn't a royal prerogative, it's a royal duty, defined not by Gudea's will, but by his office. This concept appears across Sumerian literature. In hymns dedicated to kings of the third dynasty of Ur, 2112-2004, the rulers are praised not for conquering or innovation, but for fulfilling their cosmic role. King Shulgi, who ruled for 48 years, left behind dozens of royal hymns. One of the most complete, known as Shulgi B, and preserved on tablets including CBS 7076 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, spans over 350 lines. Shulgi doesn't describe himself as supreme authority making decisions. He describes himself as the one who properly executes divine decisions. He maintains roads so that communication across the realm remains stable. He ensures justice so that social order reflects cosmic order. He performs rituals at the correct times in the correct manner. His legitimacy derives not from his abilities, but from correctly performing the functions of Nam Lugal. A particular passage is revealing. Shulgi states that Enlil has given him the me of kingship, not created them for him, not taught them to him, given them to him, transferred existing attributes or procedures from divine possession to human custody. The term me appears across thousands of Sumerian texts, yet its precise meaning remains somewhat elusive to modern scholarship. Me are usually translated as divine powers or cosmic attributes, but these translations may be too abstract. In the texts, me behave like objects. They can be held, carried, stolen, and transferred. They're countable. Texts enumerate specific me, and they're functional. Each me enables specific capabilities or operations. One of the most famous Sumerian myths, Inanna and Enki, centers entirely on the transfer of me. The goddess Inanna travels to Eridu, to the temple of Enki, the keeper of cosmic knowledge. She gets Enki drunk during a banquet, and in his intoxicated generosity, he gives her over 100 me. The text lists them: kingship, priestly office, truth, counsel, judgment, musical instruments, crafts, weapons, even betrayal and lamentation, a comprehensive toolkit of civilization. Enki doesn't create these me during the banquet. He already possesses them. Inanna doesn't develop them. She acquires them. When Enki sobers and realizes what he's done, he sends servants to retrieve the me before Inanna reaches her city of Uruk. The text describes a chase, with Inanna's boat pursued across the marshlands. She successfully evades capture and brings the me to Uruk, where they're integrated into the city's sacred complex. The mainstream interpretation treats this as an etiological myth, a story explaining why Uruk had certain religious practices or prestige. Inanna represents Uruk, Enki represents Eridu, and the myth encodes a historical shift in political or cultural dominance. But the text itself doesn't read like allegory. It describes specific me by name as discrete transferable elements. When Inanna receives them, they're presented in groups. He gave her the high priesthood. He gave her the throne. He gave her truth. He gave her the descent into the underworld and the ascent from it. Each me is named, transferred, and secured in Inanna's boat for transport. What if the Sumerians meant this more literally than we assume? Not that physical objects changed hands, But that knowledge, procedural knowledge, knowledge of how to perform certain functions, was transmitted in a formal ritualized manner. The me as a kind of cosmic curriculum, components of which could be transferred between authorized custodians. Nam-Lugal appears in the list of me given by Enki to Inanna. Kingship is one of the me. It exists in the same category as priesthood, judgment, music, and metalworking, a functional capability that enables certain operations when correctly implemented. This framing would make the Sumerian king list's opening statement less mystical and more procedural. After the kingship descended from heaven, after the procedural knowledge and authority to implement human divine governance was transmitted from its source to earthly custodians, first to Eridu, city of Enki, the keeper of me, then, after disruption through flood, transmitted again to Kish. The burden of the keeper, then, isn't power, it's responsibility. Nam-Lugal doesn't make you supreme, it makes you accountable. You become the point of contact between cosmic order and earthly implementation. You must maintain the procedures correctly. You must preserve the knowledge for transmission to your successor. You must build the temples according to specification. You must perform the rituals at the correct times. You must ensure justice reflects divine law. Fall at these duties, and Nam-Lugal moves elsewhere. The Sumerian king list records this repeatedly. Kingship resides in a city for generations, then it's taken and brought to another. Not through military conquest. The text distinguishes between defeating a city and acquiring kingship. You could destroy a rival's armies and still not possess Nam-Lugal. The cosmic office transferred according to its own logic, beyond human manipulation. Unless perhaps you knew the procedures, unless you understood what the me of kingship required, unless you could demonstrate to the divine realm that you were a legitimate keeper. The text suggests the Sumerians believed they possessed this knowledge. Not complete knowledge. Many hymns acknowledge the inscrutability of divine will, but operational knowledge, enough to maintain the system, enough to preserve what had been entrusted to them. From where? The texts don't say. From heaven, always heaven. But heaven as a location, not a spiritual state. Heaven as the source realm from which Nam-Lugal descended, first before memory in the days of the early kings, then again after the flood. The keeper's burden is remembering, executing, transmitting, and the Sumerians kept records of everything, copying and recopying their most important texts across centuries, ensuring that future keepers would have access to what earlier keepers had known. What they kept returning to, in text after text, was the original descent, the establishment of the template. When kingship first came to earth, and the office began that would pass from city to city, king to king, but would always remain fundamentally the same, a cosmic function temporarily held by human vessels, legitimate only when correctly aligned with its source. The blueprint of power. The catalogue of me given by Enki to Inanna spans over 100 discrete elements. Scholars have compiled and compared lists from multiple versions of the Inanna and Enki text, which exists in fragmentary form across several tablets from different periods. The core narrative remains consistent. These divine powers exist as a defined set, they're in Enki's custody, and they're transferable. Reading the list is disorienting. Some me are what we'd expect from divine attributes: lordship, divinity, the crown, the throne, priesthood. Others are practical arts, metalworking, leather crafts, weaving, woodworking. Still others seem procedural or conceptual: truth, counsel, judgment, decision-making. Some are disturbing: destruction of cities, lamentation, fear. The list doesn't distinguish between what we'd call religious, technological, social, or destructive myth. All exist in the same ontological category. All are necessary components of what the text calls civilization, and all, according to the myth, originated together in Enki's temple in Eridu, where they were guarded and maintained until Inanna acquired them for Uruk. Mainstream scholarship interprets this as Sumerian theological speculation about the nature of culture. The me represent their analysis of what makes civilization function, both its constructive and destructive elements, catalogued with characteristic thoroughness. The myth itself serves to explain Uruk's prominence and Inanna's importance in the pantheon. This interpretation is reasonable. The Sumerians clearly engaged in sophisticated abstract thinking about social organisation, as evidenced by their elaborate legal codes, administrative structures, and religious institutions. The me could represent their attempt to categorise and understand the components of their own culture. But there's a persistent oddity in how the texts treat me. They're never described as concepts that gods embody or principles gods represent. They're described as things gods possess. The distinction matters. Zeus embodies thunder. Enki possesses the me of divination. Inanna embodies love and war. She possesses the me of kingship and the throne. When Inanna steals the me, Enki's servants chase her to retrieve them before she reaches Uruk. The text describes specific attempts at specific locations. At the first stopping place, the Enkum approaches, a priest servant of Enki. Inanna's vizier Ninshuber protects the boat. At the second stopping place, they approach again. 6 times the servants try to reclaim the me before Inanna successfully reaches Uruk. If the me were simply aspects of the god's nature, this chase would be nonsensical. But if the me were knowledge, procedural instructions, operational protocols, the actual working details of how to perform the functions named, then the chase becomes logical. Enki has given away his copy of the manual. Once Inanna reaches her city and implements them there, the knowledge will be distributed. It can't be taken back. There's a curious parallel here with how ancient cultures across the world treated sacred and technical knowledge, initiatory mysteries, craft secrets, ritual procedures. These were often understood as discrete packages of knowledge that could be transmitted only to properly prepared recipients. The transmission itself was formalized, witnessed, and recorded. Once transmitted, the knowledge could be passed forward, but couldn't be erased from those who'd received it. The me of kingship appears early in Enki's gifts to Inanna. He gave her the high priesthood. He gave her godship. He gave her the exalted and enduring crown. He gave her the throne of kingship. These aren't described as Inanna gaining attributes she didn't have. She's already a major goddess. She's acquiring procedures and authorities that expand her operational domain. What would the me of kingship contain? If we take the procedural interpretation seriously, it would be the operational knowledge needed to properly establish and maintain the kingship office. How to select or recognise a legitimate king. How to perform the investiture ceremony. What rituals maintain the connection between the earthly king and the divine realm. What responsibilities the king must fulfill. What signs indicate the me has been withdrawn. The Code of Unamu from around 2100 BC provides a possible glimpse of this procedural knowledge in action. The stellar fragments that remain show King Unamu receiving the law from the sun god Shamash. The image is formal, ritualized. Shamash extends his hand holding a rod and ring, symbols of divine authority and justice. Unamu receives them. The accompanying text makes clear that Unamu isn't inventing these laws. He's not even claiming to have thought of them and received divine approval. He's recording laws that have been given to him. The prologue describes how Unamu was chosen by the gods to restore order after a period of corruption and injustice. His role is restorative, not innovative. The laws themselves are remarkably sophisticated, emphasizing monetary compensation rather than physical retribution. They presume a complex economy, standardized currency, courts that can evaluate claims, and social structures that can enforce judgments. This isn't primitive tribal justice. This is a fully developed legal system that assumes considerable prior infrastructure. But Unamu's inscriptions don't describe developing this system. They describe implementing it. The system, the procedural knowledge of how justice should function, already exists. Unamu receives the authority to execute it. This pattern repeats throughout Sumerian royal inscriptions. Kings describe receiving me, being given the throne, being chosen to implement divine order. Remarkably few describe seizing power or achieving supremacy through their own strength. Even kings who clearly came to power through military force frame their legitimacy in terms of divine selection rather than successful conquest. Why would conquerors consistently describe themselves as recipients rather than achievers? The standard explanation is that this language provided a veneer of religious legitimacy for political power. Claiming divine selection is better propaganda than admitting you killed your way to the throne. Yet the consistency of this framing across centuries and across rival cities suggests it's more than propaganda. The Sumerians genuinely seemed to believe that legitimate kingship required more than military victory or popular support. It required possession of Namlugal, the me of kingship, the actual operational authority transmitted from the divine realm. A king without these me might rule by force, but he wouldn't have kingship. He'd be Lugal without Namlugal, a powerful man without the cosmic office. His decrees wouldn't align with divine order. His reign would be illegitimate, temporary, vulnerable to the gods, transferring true kingship elsewhere. This belief created practical consequences. Cities didn't always submit to the strongest military force. They submitted to whoever could demonstrate possession of legitimate kingship. This demonstration required ritual performance, ceremonies that showed the king had received the me, could perform the required functions, and maintained the proper relationship with the divine realm. The sacred marriage rite, performed annually in many Sumerian cities, may have functioned as one such demonstration. The king, representing the shepherd god Dumuzid, ritually married the goddess Inanna, represented by the high priestess. The ceremony took place in the temple during the New Year festival. Its successful performance demonstrated that the king still maintained divine favour, that the me of kingship remained in his possession. A text from the reign of King Shu-sin of Ur, dating to around 2037-2029 BC, describes this ritual from the goddess's perspective. Preserved on a tablet known as Istanbul 2461, now displayed at the Museum of the Ancient Orient in Istanbul, the text is often called the love song for Shu-sin, or simply the world's oldest love poem. But the poetry serves a specific purpose. The goddess declares her love for the king, chooses him as her bridegroom, and promises to intercede with her father Enlil on his behalf. This isn't just romantic expression, it's a statement of continued legitimacy. The goddess has chosen this king. She renews that choice annually through the ritual. Her intercession with Enlil means the chief of the gods will continue to support this king's possession of Namlugal. If the king failed to properly perform the ritual, if the goddess didn't choose him, if the signs indicated divine favour had been withdrawn, his legitimacy would collapse. Not because the people would overthrow him, but because the cosmic office he held would be understood as having departed. He might retain physical power, but he'd have lost kingship itself. The Sumerians took this seriously enough to record successful performances and interpret failures. When cities fell to external conquest or internal rebellion, the texts sometimes describe this as kingship departing. The gods had withdrawn Namlugal. They'd given it elsewhere. The former king, no matter how powerful he'd been, no longer held the office. Consider the implications if the Sumerians were right. Not right in the religious sense we'd assume, that literal gods in a literal heaven were making these decisions, but right in perceiving that legitimacy requires something beyond force or consent. That authority can't be seized, only received. That governance works only when it's aligned with something beyond human will. Modern political philosophy struggles with legitimacy. By what right does anyone govern another? By force? By agreement? By utility? The Sumerians would have found these answers insufficient. Force creates temporary compliance, not order. Agreement can be withdrawn. Utility changes with circumstances. True legitimacy, they believed, came from alignment with cosmic order, with the fundamental structures of reality itself. Nam-Lugal was the mechanism of that alignment. The me of kingship was the transmitted knowledge of how to maintain it. And the entire system rested on the claim that this knowledge had been given to humanity from elsewhere in the distant past and had been preserved through careful custody and transmission ever since. Whether that claim is true or delusional or metaphorical is secondary to recognizing what the Sumerians believed they were doing. They weren't inventing political structures and then claiming divine sanction. They were attempting to preserve and correctly implement a system they believed predated them. Their elaborate rituals weren't primitive superstition. They were quality control procedures to ensure the system continued operating as designed. Every temple built according to Enki's specifications. Every law code received from Shamash's hand. Every sacred marriage performed at the proper time. Every king's hymn describing not his achievements, but his faithful execution of cosmic function. All of this was documentation of a system in operation, maintained by keepers who understood themselves as transmitters of inherited knowledge rather than inventors of novel practices. The blueprint of power, in their understanding, hadn't been drawn by human hands. It had been given. Their responsibility was preservation. Corruption of the blueprint, innovation, departure from tradition, failure to perform the procedures correctly would break the alignment. Kingship would depart. The gods would choose another vessel. So they kept copying the texts, memorizing the procedures, training scribes in the proper forms, building temples to exact specifications, recording everything so that if catastrophe came again as it had with the flood, the next generation would still have access to what had been given. What exactly had been given? The texts say, the me, over 100 distinct elements of civilization, all together, all functional, already complete, not developing over time, not evolving from simple to complex, present as a system, transferred from divine custody to human implementation. Enki held them in Eridu until Inar acquired them for Uruk. But the texts hint that Enki didn't create them either. He was their keeper, their guardian. And if Enki was only a keeper, not a creator, then the question presses deeper. Where did the me originate? When? And why were humans given access to them? The texts preserve the question more carefully than they offer answers. Before the waters rose. The World Blundell Prism dedicates its opening section to 8 kings who ruled before the flood. The precision is striking, not in ancient times before memory, but specifically before the flood, an event treated as a chronological marker dividing history into 2 distinct periods. The 8 antediluvian kings ruled from 5 cities, Eridu, Bad-Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. The names are significant. These cities appear in other Sumerian texts as the oldest urban centres, the places where civilization first took form. And the list concludes, then the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven once more, this time to Kish. The structure suggests a cycle. Kingship descends, it establishes in Eridu, it transfers through the antediluvian cities. Catastrophe disrupts the system, kingship descends again, it establishes in Kish, it transfers through post-diluvian cities. The pattern continues through observable history. Those reign lengths, though, Elulim, 28,800 years, Alulgar, 36,000 years, the total span of all 8 pre-flood kings, 241,200 years. These numbers don't fit with human biology, human history, or geological timescales that would allow for a literal global flood. The conventional scholarly approach is to recognize these as mythological prologue. Many cultures have creation myths that include primordial times when things worked differently, when gods walked among humans, when lifespans were extended, when magic was real. The antediluvian section of the king list fits this pattern. It's not meant as literal history, it's explaining cosmic origins, giving mythological depth to the king list that follows. And yet, the Sumerians themselves seemed confused about the distinction between mythological and historical time. Their astronomical texts demonstrate sophisticated mathematical understanding. Their administrative records show meticulous accuracy. Their legal documents make careful distinctions between testimony, evidence, and proof. These aren't people who casually conflated fact and fantasy. When they recorded the antediluvian kings with impossible reign lengths, they used the same formal structure, the same linguistic patterns, and the same administrative tone they used for historical kings whose reigns we can verify. They didn't mark a transition from mythological prologue to historical record. The document flows continuously from Alulim to Gilgamesh to kings whose inscriptions we've excavated from their palaces. Several scholars have proposed that the reign lengths might encode something other than individual human lifespans. The numbers are consistently divisible by 60, the base of the Sumerian numerical system. They're expressed in specific mathematical units: Sars 3600, Ners 600, Sos 60. This mathematical regularity suggests the numbers might be symbolic, perhaps astronomical cycles, perhaps dynasty lengths, perhaps something else we haven't decoded. Another interpretation, proposed by historian Thorkild Jacobsen and developed by others, suggests that the antediluvian kings might represent not individuals but institutions. What if Alulim ruled 28,800 years means the kingship office, as instituted by the one remembered as Alulim, continued to function for 28,800 years? This would make the king list a record of institutional continuity rather than biological longevity. Under this reading, the text documents how long the office of kingship, Nam Lugal, remained in continuous operation in each location before transferring elsewhere. Eridu held kingship for 2 administrative periods, Ilulim and Alnar. Batibira held it for 3 periods. The system operated for a total of 241,200 years until disrupted by flood. This interpretation would explain why the reign lengths decrease in post-diluvian periods. After the flood, political instability increased. Cities rose and fell more rapidly, wars became more frequent, kingship transferred more often because the conditions for sustained institutional continuity had deteriorated. The pattern in the king list supports this. Pre-flood, 8 rulers over 241,200 years. Immediately post-flood dynasty, 23 rulers over 24,510 years. Second dynasty of Uruk, 12 rulers over 2,310 years. By the time we reach historically verifiable kings like Gilgamesh, reigns are measured in decades, not centuries. The trend is consistent. As we move closer to the present, the numbers become more plausible until they align with what human lifespans could support. What if this pattern reflects actual memory of institutional degradation over time? Not that individual humans lived for thousands of years, but that political systems became progressively more unstable, causing the office of kingship to transfer more frequently. There's a parallel concept in Chinese historiography. The mandate of heaven could be held by a dynasty for centuries, passing from emperor to emperor within the same family line. The mandate itself didn't change. The dynasty maintained it through proper governance. When governance failed, the mandate transferred to another family. The Zhou dynasty claimed the mandate for over 800 years. The concept of continuous authority operating through successive vessels isn't foreign to human political thought. What makes the Sumerian version unique is the claim about origin. The mandate of heaven was a Chinese development, a philosophical framework created to explain and legitimize political change. Nam Lugal, according to the Sumerian texts, wasn't developed. It descended. It existed before the cities that housed it, before the flood that disrupted it, before human civilization as we'd recognize it. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablets CBS 1673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, provides another perspective on the pre-flood period. This fragmentary text, dating to around 1600 BC, but recording far older traditions, describes the creation of humans, the establishment of cities, and the god's decision to send the flood. The tablet is frustratingly damaged. Large sections are missing, but what remains is revealing. The text describes 5 cities being established before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, exactly the 5 cities named in the king list's antediluvian section. These cities weren't mentioned as examples or selections from a larger group. They're presented as the 5 cities, the complete set. Each city is assigned to a specific god: Eridu to Enki, god of wisdom; Bad Tibira to Dumuzi, shepherd god; Larak to the sun god; Sippar to Shamash; Shuruppak to the birth goddess. The assignments aren't random. Each god's attributes align with what's known about these cities' later religious centres. Then the text describes why the flood came. Humanity had become too numerous, too noisy, the gods couldn't sleep. Enlil, chief of the gods, decides to destroy humanity with flood. But Enki, the keeper of wisdom, opposes the plan. He warns a king named Zusudra, giving him instructions to build a boat and preserve life through the catastrophe. After the flood, kingship is re-established. The system continues. Mainstream interpretation treats this as a variant of the widespread Near Eastern flood mythology, most famously preserved in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. The flood narrative appears across multiple cultures in this region, suggesting either a shared mythological tradition or possibly distant cultural memory of significant local flooding in Mesopotamian prehistory. Archaeological evidence does indicate major flooding in southern Mesopotamia around 2900 BC, with flood deposits found at several sites, including Shuruppak, the last antediluvian city in the king list. This flooding wasn't global, but it could have been regionally catastrophic, disrupting settlements and requiring significant recovery. If we entertain the institutional interpretation, the flood represents a break in continuity. The antediluvian system, whatever it was, however it functioned, was disrupted by catastrophe. The knowledge was preserved, Enki warns Ziusudra, who survives, but the system had to be re-established. Kingship descended again, now to Kish, and the long process of rebuilding civilization began. This would make the antediluvian section not mythology but compressed history, not recording that 8 individual humans each lived tens of thousands of years, but that an institutional system operated continuously through 8 distinct administrative periods spanning possibly thousands of years until catastrophic flooding disrupted it around 2900 BC. The numbers would still be difficult to reconcile with archaeology. There's no evidence of Mesopotamian cities existing 241,200 years ago. Eridu's earliest temples date to around 5000 BC. But what if the numbers were systematically inflated, perhaps through some mathematical transformation we don't understand, and what they're preserving is relative chronology rather than absolute dates? The antediluvian period was very long. It encompassed multiple distinct phases, the 8 reign. It ended with catastrophic flooding that required rebuilding. This reading would make the Sumerian king list function similarly to genealogies in other ancient texts. Not precise chronologies, but frameworks for understanding historical depth and continuity. The numbers communicate this is old, this came first, this was disrupted, this was restored. But there's still that opening phrase, after the kingship descended from heaven, not after kingship was established or after the first king arose. Descended from heaven, a specific claim about origin that the text treats as the foundational event of civilized history. The antediluvian kings aren't described as creating kingship or developing it. They're described as ruling within a system that already existed when they received it. Elulim, the first name, means stag, possibly a title or epithet rather than a personal name. The text doesn't say he invented kingship or founded the office. It says kingship descended to Eridu and Elulim was king there. What if the impossibly long reign lengths are encoding something else entirely? Not time, not dynasty length, but something the Sumerians considered important enough to preserve numerically: astronomical cycles, construction projects, population figures. We've lost the key to the code, but that doesn't mean the code is meaningless. The ancient Sumerians were aware They were recording information for distant future audiences. They built tablets to last, fired them hard, stored them in temple archives. They copied important texts across generations. When they placed these numbers at the beginning of their most significant historical document, they intended those numbers to be preserved. What if the true message isn't in the literal meaning of 2800 years, but in the pattern? 8 kings, 5 cities, continuous operation, then disruption, then restoration, then continuation through progressively shorter periods as the system becomes less stable. The pattern says, this is old, this was continuous, this was interrupted, this was recovered, and it continues through us to you. And embedded in that pattern, like a signature, kingship descended from heaven, not once, but twice, before and after the flood. Whatever established this system was still operative after catastrophe, still able to transmit Namlugal to Earth, still the source from which legitimate authority must derive. The keepers before the flood maintained the system for what the numbers say was a very long time. The catastrophe came. The keepers after the flood rebuilt it, using whatever knowledge had been preserved. And that work of preservation and rebuilding continued through every king named in the list, through the scribes who copied it, through the prism itself, fired and buried and excavated, and housed now in climate-controlled glass, still preserving the claim, still waiting for someone to understand not just what it says, but what it means. The architecture of connection. In the flat alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, there are no mountains, no natural high places, no stone outcrops where earth rises towards sky. And yet the Sumerians were obsessed with height, with elevation, with creating artificial mountains in one of the flattest landscapes on earth. The ziggurat at Ur stands even now, partially reconstructed, its massive stepped form rising from the desert. King Unamu built it around 2100 BC, dedicating it to Nana, the moon god. What remains today is impressive. The base platform alone measures roughly 62 by 43 metres, and the original structure rose in 3 tiers to approximately 30 metres high. But the reconstruction is incomplete. We're looking at the skeleton of something more complex. The ziggurat's core was solid mud brick, millions of sun-dried bricks, each one made by hand, each one carried into place. The exterior was sheathed in fired brick, much more durable, laid with bitumen mortar. The fired brick facing was over 2 metres thick. This wasn't decorative. It was engineering, protection against rain, against the elements, designed to preserve the structure for ages. 3 massive staircases led to the first tier, 2 flanking staircases along the sides, and 1 central staircase perpendicular to the facade. These weren't continuous ramps. They were true staircases, hundreds of steps, each precisely sized, angled at exactly 45 degrees. The effort required to build this rivals anything attempted in Mesopotamian architecture. At the summit sat a temple, the place where heaven and earth were understood to meet. The temple itself is gone, destroyed in antiquity, but foundation texts and dedicatory inscriptions describe it. This was the dwelling place of Nana, where the god descended to receive worship, where offerings were presented, where the boundary between divine and human realms became permeable. The standard interpretation of ziggurats treats them as symbolic cosmic mountains. Ancient Mesopotamian cosmology conceived of the gods dwelling on cosmic mountains at the centre of the universe. Cities couldn't be built on actual mountains in the Sumerian heartland, so they created artificial ones. The ziggurat represents human aspiration to reach the divine, while simultaneously providing a high place for gods to descend to earth. Its symbolic architecture, impressive certainly, but fundamentally expressing religious ideas through monumental form. This interpretation is well supported. Texts from throughout Mesopotamian history describe temples as cosmic mountains. The names given to ziggurats reference this concept: House of the Mountain, Mountain of the Storm, Bond of Heaven, and earth. The symbolism is clear and consistent, but symbolism and function aren't mutually exclusive. What if the ziggurats were designed to be symbolically powerful precisely because they were functionally important? What if the architecture wasn't representing a cosmic truth, but implementing one? Consider the precision of ziggurat construction. The orientation of the ziggurat's corners aligns almost exactly with the cardinal directions: northeast, southeast, southwest, northwest. The deviation is minimal, less than 1 degree. This alignment appears in every major ziggurat excavated from the Sumerian period. The builders had no magnetic compasses. They aligned these structures using astronomical observation, achieving remarkable accuracy. The dimensions follow mathematical proportions: the ratio of length to width, the relationship between tier heights, the angles of the staircases. These aren't arbitrary. They follow consistent patterns across different ziggurats in different cities built by different kings, as though the builders were working from a template, a set of specifications that defined proper proportions. The Gudea cylinders, which we encountered earlier, describe this explicitly. When Gudea receives divine instruction to build the temple of Ningirsu, the god provides specific measurements. The temple platform must be so many cubits in length and width. The walls must be so many cubits thick. Specific rooms must be positioned in specific locations. The text reads like an architectural blueprint, not poetic vision. Gudea's anxiety about getting these specifications correct pervades the narrative. He consults divination to ensure he understands properly. He requests confirmation from the goddess Nanshi. He travels to acquire the exact materials specified: specific types of stone from mountains far away, timber from distant forests. The successful completion of the temple depends on executing the divine pattern accurately. What was the pattern for? If temples were simply places of worship, the precise dimensions wouldn't matter. Human architecture varies by culture, available materials, aesthetic preferences, and practical constraints. But the Sumerian temple architecture shows remarkable consistency across time and space. The later Babylonians and Assyrians continued building ziggurats according to similar proportions. The basic template persists for over 2,000 years. One explanation is tradition. Once established, architectural forms become canonical, repeated because they're recognized as proper. This happens in all cultures, but the Sumerian texts frame the continuity differently. They don't describe copying tradition, they describe executing received specifications. The temple as bond between heaven and earth takes on different implications if we consider it functionally rather than symbolically. A bond isn't just a connection, it's something that holds together, that maintains relationship under stress. If the temple architecture was understood as actually implementing the connection between divine and human realms, then building it correctly would be critical to maintaining that connection. The summit temple served specific ritual purposes. Offerings were presented there. Specific ceremonies occurred at specific times. Astronomical observations were conducted from these high platforms. Many temples had astronomical functions, tracking solstices, equinoxes, and planetary movements. The temple staff included scribes who recorded celestial observations, calculated calendars, and determined auspicious dates for royal activities. What if the architecture was designed to support these functions? The elevation providing clear lines of sight for astronomical observation, the orientation aligning with celestial movements, the precise proportions creating acoustic properties that enhanced ritual chanting, the structure serving as an astronomical observatory, ritual centre, and administrative hub simultaneously. This would make ziggurat architecture a technology not in the narrow modern sense of mechanical devices, but in the broader sense of purposefully designed systems for accomplishing specific goals. The goal, in this case, being to maintain proper relationship between city and cosmos, between human governance and divine order. Namlugal, The office of kingship required connection to its source. The king wasn't autonomous. He was a vessel, a conduit. His legitimacy derived from maintained alignment with the divine realm. The temple provided the architecture for that alignment. Consider the sacred marriage rite again, but now in architectural context. The ceremony took place in the temple at the ziggurat's summit. The king ascended the massive staircase, a literal elevation from the earthly city to the divine dwelling place. At the summit, he entered the temple where the goddess, represented by the high priestess, awaited. The ritual union occurred in this elevated liminal space, neither fully earthly nor fully divine. The descent afterward completed the circuit. The king returned to the city below, carrying renewed divine sanction. He ascended as man. He descended as divinely authorized ruler. The architecture created the pathway for this transformation. Every ziggurat had drains, extensive drainage systems, carefully engineered into the structure. The standard explanation is practical, preventing water damage from rain, but the drains were often more elaborate than strictly necessary for water management. They connected the summit to subterranean spaces at the ziggurat's base, creating a vertical circuit from high place through the structure to underground chambers. Some texts reference the Abzu, the underground freshwater realm, ruled by Enki, being accessed through temples. The connection between celestial heights and subterranean depths, both accessed through the same architectural structure, suggests the temple functioned as axis mundi, the cosmic axis connecting all realms. If we take the architectural precision seriously, if we accept that the Sumerians believed they were implementing received specifications rather than expressing religious sentiment through impressive buildings, then the ziggurat becomes something more than monument. It becomes infrastructure. Infrastructure for what? For the system of divine kingship to operate, for the connection between heavenly authority and earthly governance to remain stable, for the observational and ritual practices that demonstrated continued alignment with cosmic order, for the preservation and transmission of the me, including Nam Lugal. This interpretation would explain why ziggurats required such enormous investment of resources. Namu's ziggurat consumed millions of bricks. The labour force must have been substantial, working for years. The economic cost was massive. For a purely symbolic structure, even one central to religious life, the investment seems disproportionate. But if the ziggurat was understood as critical infrastructure, as necessary for maintaining the system that legitimized all governance, all social order, all continuity with the antediluvian past, then no investment would be too great. Failing to build it properly, or allowing it to fall into disrepair, would jeopardize the entire cosmic relationship on which civilization depended. The Sumerians didn't build ziggurats once and maintain them, they rebuilt them. The temple at Eridu shows 18 construction phases, each building atop the ruins of the previous one. Each reconstruction followed the same orientation, the same essential plan. Over thousands of years, the template was executed again and again. This isn't the behaviour of a culture following empty tradition. This is the behaviour of a culture maintaining critical systems. You don't repeatedly reconstruct infrastructure unless you believe it's actually doing something necessary. What the ziggurats were doing, according to the texts, was connecting, creating the bond between heaven and earth, providing the architecture through which kingship could descend, could be maintained, could be transmitted. The architecture of connection, built according to received pattern, oriented to the heavens, elevated above the earthly plane, precisely proportioned, maintained across generations at enormous cost. Because if the connection broke, if the alignment failed, if the architecture didn't properly implement the template, then the system would stop functioning, kingship wouldn't descend, the me would be lost. The knowledge carefully preserved since before the flood would prove useless, because the structure required for its implementation would have failed, so they built, and rebuilt, and maintained, following the specifications, measuring carefully, using the right materials, performing the rituals at the summit according to precise timing, keeping the connection open, maintaining the pathway, ensuring that what descended from heaven all those centuries ago at Eridu could continue descending, continue operating, continue providing legitimate authority to earthly governance. The architecture stood as proof, not of primitive superstition, but of sophisticated understanding that some things require specific conditions to function properly, that connections must be maintained. That infrastructure, even cosmic infrastructure, demands precision and ongoing investment. The ziggurats remain, even in ruin, testimony to a civilization that believed maintaining connection to something beyond themselves was worth any cost, and that the architecture to sustain that connection had been given to them as surely as the kingship itself, built not to express belief, but to enable function, the dream that built temples. Gudea was not a great military conqueror. He left no records of expansive campaigns or subjugated enemies. His inscriptions don't boast of tribute collected or rivals defeated. Instead, across dozens of statues and 2 massive clay cylinders, Gudea documented in extraordinary detail how he built a temple. The Gudea cylinders, preserved in the Louvre as AO3293 and AO3295, contain over 400 lines of Sumerian text inscribed in neat columns. The language is precise, technical, administrative. This isn't poetry, though modern translations sometimes smooth it into poetic form. It's documentation. The narrative begins with Gudea receiving a dream. In the dream, divine figures appear. A man of enormous size fills the space from earth to sky, crowned with the divine crown, accompanied by the An's bird and a lion. A goddess holds a lapis lazuli tablet showing the plan of a temple. A third figure carries a tablet of precious stone and draws the ground plan of a house. Gudea wakes troubled. He doesn't immediately know what the dream means, despite the apparently clear imagery. The uncertainty is significant. If this was simply literary device, the symbolism would be transparent. But Gudea needs interpretation. He travels to the temple of the goddess Nanshi, known for her gift of dream interpretation. Nanshi decodes the vision. The enormous man is Ningirsu, the city god of Lagash, Gudea's city. The lapis lazuli tablet with a temple plan is carried by Nisaba, goddess of writing and architecture. The third figure is Nindub, drawing the foundation plan. The dream is instruction. Ningirsu requires his temple to be built, and Gudea has been chosen as the human agent to accomplish it. What follows isn't the expected response of a divinely chosen king. Gudea doesn't immediately marshal resources and begin construction. He's anxious. He questions whether he understands correctly. He requests additional confirmation through divination, examining livers of sacrificed animals, interpreting omens, consulting oracles. Only after multiple confirmations does he begin preliminary preparations. The text then catalogues these preparations with bureaucratic thoroughness. Gudea purifies the city. He proclaims a period of special sanctity. He suspends normal legal actions, no debts collected, no lawsuits pursued, no punishments administered. Slaves are given respite. The entire city enters a liminal state, set apart for the divine work to come. Then comes the procurement catalogue. The cylinders list in detail the materials required and where they must be obtained. Cedar wood from the Amanus Mountains, cypress from the Mountain of Cypresses, gold dust from the mountains, silver from Maluha, carnelian from Ethiopia, copper from the ranges of copper, diorite from specific quarries, alabaster from the Alabaster Mountains. These aren't symbolic or poetic descriptions. Archaeological evidence confirms that Lagash during Gudea's reign, around 2144-2124 BCE, did indeed import materials from these distant locations. The trade networks were extensive, reaching from the mountains of modern Lebanon to the Indus Valley, from Ethiopia to Anatolia. The cylinders document a massive procurement operation spanning years. But here's what's curious. The text doesn't describe Gudea deciding what materials to use based on availability or preference. It describes him obtaining the specific materials specified in the divine plan. The lapis lazuli tablet shown by Nisaba apparently contained not just the temple's footprint, but material specifications. Cylinder A dedicates hundreds of lines to describing how Gudea acquires each required material. He sends expeditions to quarries, he establishes trade relationships, he organises transport of massive stone blocks across hundreds of miles. The logistics are staggering, moving multi-ton blocks of stone through marsh and desert without wheeled vehicles, using only sledges, rollers and river barges. The description of the temple's construction when it finally begins provides architectural specifics. The foundation is laid according to precise measurements. The platform rises to a specified height. Walls are built with exact thicknesses. Rooms are positioned according to the revealed plan. Cedar beams are placed at measured intervals. Doorways are positioned to align with celestial observations. The sanctuary is located in the prescribed position with prescribed dimensions. Mainstream interpretation treats the Gudea cylinders as royal propaganda dressed in religious garb. Gudea was ruler of a relatively small city-state during the Gutian period, when centralized power in Mesopotamia had collapsed. He couldn't claim military glory or vast empire. Instead, he claimed piety. His legitimacy derived from religious devotion, demonstrated through temple construction. The dream narrative and divine instructions provide religious validation for his rule. This interpretation is reasonable. Many rulers have claimed divine sanction for their authority. The Gudea cylinders serve his political interests by casting him as the god's chosen agent. The elaborate detail about materials and construction demonstrates his wealth and administrative capability while framing these as service to divine will rather than personal ambition. Yet there's something odd about the specificity. If this was simply political propaganda, why document the procurement of materials with such bureaucratic precision? Why list specific mountains, specific types of stone, specific quantities? Why anxiously recount the need for repeated confirmation before beginning? The text reads more like a project manual than propaganda. It documents not just that Gudea built a temple, but how he built it. What materials? What dimensions? What procedures? The level of detail suggests the text serves a documentary purpose, preserving for future readers the complete process of temple construction according to divine specification. Consider the possibility that Gudea genuinely believed he was executing a received pattern, not inventing a temple design and claiming divine approval, but implementing specifications he'd received through recognized channels of divine communication. The dream, the interpretation, the omens, these weren't literary devices. They were the actual procedures through which the divine realm communicated requirements to human executors. If this was the case, then the anxiety makes sense. Gudea had to get it right. Building a temple incorrectly wouldn't just be a construction failure. It would be a failure to properly execute divine instruction, potentially breaking the connection between his city and the cosmic realm, invalidating his kingship and bringing disaster on his people. The repeated confirmations weren't superstitious caution, they were quality control. Before committing enormous resources to a years-long construction project, Gudea needed to verify he'd understood the specifications correctly. The dream provided the general instruction. Nanshi's interpretation clarified the symbolism, but Gudea still needed to confirm details, exact dimensions, material specifications, construction sequences, ritual requirements. The divination procedures he employed, extispicy animaling, observation of oil patterns in water, interpretation of astronomical signs, these weren't primitive superstition. They were the recognized technical procedures for receiving detailed information from the divine realm. The Sumerians and later Mesopotamian cultures developed sophisticated divination systems with standardized interpretation manuals. Extispicy particularly was treated as a technical skill, with specialist priests trained in reading patterns according to detailed catalogues of omens. From their perspective, divination was communication technology. You couldn't simply ask the gods questions and receive verbal answers. Communication required specialized procedures and trained interpreters, but it was still communication, functional, informational, serving practical purposes. Gudea used these communication channels to receive and verify the temple specifications. Then he executed them with the full resources of his state. The result, according to the cylinders, was a structure that properly housed the divine presence. Ningirsu entered his temple. The connection was established. Gudea's kingship was validated through successful implementation of divine instruction. The text concludes with Ningirsu blessing Gudea and the city. The god pronounces prosperity over Lagash. Order is established. Justice prevails. The city flourishes. These blessings flow not from the gods arbitrarily favouring Gudea, but from Gudea successfully completing the work he was assigned. This pattern, divine instruction, anxious verification, precise execution, resulting blessing, appears throughout ancient Near Eastern temple-building narratives. King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, according to biblical account, was built according to patterns shown to David by divine revelation, with exact specifications for dimensions, materials, and furnishings. The construction is described in extraordinary architectural detail, similar to the Gudea cylinders. Across cultures and centuries, the pattern repeats, sacred architecture follows, received specifications. The builders don't design freely. They implement patterns revealed from divine sources. The precision matters. Getting it right enables proper function. What function? The texts consistently describe it as creating dwelling place for divine presence, but perhaps more specifically, creating the conditions under which divine presence can manifest in the human realm. The architecture implements interface between realms that are normally separate. If we take this seriously, if we accept that the builders believed they were implementing functional specifications rather than expressing religious aesthetics, then the precision of temple architecture becomes comprehensible. You don't arbitrarily change specifications for systems you don't fully understand. You execute them as received, even if the reasoning behind certain requirements isn't transparent. Gudea's dream provided the pattern. Nisaba's lapis lazuli tablet showed the plan. Nindub drew the foundation. These weren't metaphors. They were the information delivery mechanism for a construction project that couldn't be successfully executed without accurate specifications. And Gudea documented the entire process, from dream through completion, inscribed permanently in clay, so that future generations would have record not just of the temple's existence, but of how properly to build according to divine pattern. The cylinders remain, the text still legible, preserving Gudea's anxious verification, his meticulous procurement, his precise execution, not boasting of achievement, but documenting faithful implementation of received instruction, as though the most important thing a king could do wasn't conquer or innovate, but correctly execute the cosmic blueprints entrusted to human custody. The marriage that sustained worlds. In the cool darkness of the Museum of the Ancient Orient in Istanbul, a small clay tablet, barely 4 inches across, contains words that have been called the world's oldest love poem. Catalogued as Istanbul 2461, dating to approximately 2000 BC, the text is written in Sumerian cuneiform. Its language is intimate, sensual, full of longing and desire. Bridegroom, dear to my heart, goodly is your beauty, honey sweet. Lion, dear to my heart, goodly is your beauty, honey sweet. The speaker is Inanna, goddess of love, fertility, and war. She addresses Shusin, king of Ur, ruling around 2037-2029 BCE. She declares her love for him, her desire to marry him, her intention to intercede with her father Enlil on his behalf. The poetry continues for 50 lines, alternating between Inanna's voice and narration. Modern readers often encounter this text as curiosity, proof that human romantic expression stretches back millennia unchanged, that the feelings captured in ancient Sumerian aren't alien despite the vast chronological distance. Love is love across time and culture. But the text wasn't composed for private expression. It was a ritual script. The sacred marriage rite, called hieros gamos in Greek, occurred annually in major Sumerian cities during the New Year festival. The king, representing the shepherd god Dumuzid, also called Tammuz, ritually married the goddess Inanna, represented by the end priestess or high priestess of the city. The ceremony took place in the temple, typically at the ziggurat summit in the divine dwelling place. The mainstream interpretation treats this as fertility ritual. By enacting the divine marriage, by symbolically ensuring the union of god and goddess, the rite magically promoted fertility in flocks, fields, and human population. The king and priestess embodied cosmic forces whose union maintained abundance. The ceremony served important psychological and social functions, reinforcing the king's legitimacy, involving the community in renewal celebration, marking the turning of the year with sacred drama. This interpretation is well supported by comparative analysis of fertility rituals across cultures. The hieros gamos appears in multiple ancient Near Eastern traditions. The basic pattern, ritual union of male and female representatives enacting divine marriage, seems designed to ensure agricultural and reproductive fertility through sympathetic magic. But let's look more carefully at what the Sumerian texts actually describe. The Istanbul 2461 poem presents Inanna choosing the king, not submitting to him, not being claimed by him, choosing him. Her agency drives the narrative. She declares her desire. She announces her intention to marry him. She promises to speak favourably of him to Enlil, chief of the gods. This isn't a human king claiming divine favour. This is the goddess conferring legitimacy on a specific human. The ceremony enacts choice, not conquest, and that choice must be renewed annually. Other texts provide more procedural detail. Preparations for the sacred marriage were extensive. The king underwent purification rituals. The priestess representing Inanna prepared in the temple. The city celebrated with feasting, music, and procession. The king ascended to the temple, literally climbing the ziggurat staircase, elevating himself from the earthly city to the divine dwelling place. In the temple's innermost chamber, prepared as a bridal chamber, the ritual union occurred. What precisely happened is not explicitly described in surviving texts, though scholarly consensus suggests the rite included actual sexual union between king and priestess. Whether this was literal or symbolic is debated, but the texts use concrete physical language rather than obviously metaphorical expressions. After the union, the king emerged. He descended the staircase, returning to the city below. His legitimacy for the coming year was renewed. He had been chosen again by the goddess. He maintained divine favour. His right to rule was confirmed. If the sacred marriage was simply fertility magic, why was it centred on the king? Why did the king's legitimacy depend on annual renewal of this ritual? Other fertility ceremonies existed in Sumerian religious practice, agricultural festivals, offerings at planting and harvest, rituals to ensure multiplication of flocks. None of these required the king's participation. Only the sacred marriage made the king's person central to the rite. The procedural language in texts describing the rite suggests something beyond symbolic fertility magic. The king doesn't just represent Dumuzid, he becomes Dumuzid for the duration of the ceremony. The priestess doesn't just represent Inanna, she is understood as the goddess manifest. The union isn't theatre depicting divine marriage, it's the implementation of divine marriage in earthly realm. This distinction matters. If the rite implements rather than represents, then it's serving a functional purpose in maintaining the system of divine kingship. The annual performance renews the connection between the office of kingship and its divine source. Remember the concept of Namlugal, kingship as a transferable cosmic office, not an inherent attribute of the individual who happens to be king. A Lugal great might possess strength, wisdom, wealth, military power, but he doesn't possess kingship unless Namlugal has been conferred on him, and that conferral requires connection to the divine realm. The sacred marriage may have functioned as annual verification and renewal of that connection. The goddess chooses the king again. She confirms his authorization. She promises to intercede with Enlil to maintain the chief god's support for this king's possession of the cosmic office. The union produces something. Several texts reference the outcome of the sacred marriage: prosperity, abundance, justice, stability. These aren't just blessings hoped for through fertility magic. They're described as consequences of successful ritual performance. The system operates correctly when properly maintained through annual renewal. What happens if the ritual isn't performed correctly? If the king fails in his role? If the goddess doesn't choose him? The texts rarely describe this explicitly, but the implication is clear: illegitimacy. The king might retain physical power, but he would have lost cosmic authorization. His commands wouldn't align with divine will. His reign would be vulnerable to challenge, not just from human rivals, but from divine withdrawal of support. This creates a check on royal power. The king isn't autonomous. His authority must be annually renewed through ritual that involves the priestess, the temple, the divine presence. He can't simply declare himself chosen. The ceremony must be successfully performed, with the goddess's choice manifest through proper execution of the rite. Archaeological evidence shows that sacred marriage imagery was widespread in Sumerian material culture. Cylinder seals frequently depict scenes interpreted as hierosgamos, a male figure and female figure in intimate proximity, often with divine symbols present, positioned near representations of temples or shrines. These aren't illustrations of mythology, they're markers of legitimate authority. A king might commission cylinder seals, showing his participation in sacred marriage, using them to seal administrative documents. The image on the seal communicated, "I am divinely chosen. My authority is renewed. My commands carry cosmic legitimacy." Without such markers, documents might be questioned, commands challenged, authority disputed. The practical implications of this system are significant. Kingship requires ongoing validation. You can't seize power and claim divine right indefinitely. You must continually demonstrate maintained connection to the divine source of authority. The annual sacred marriage provides the mechanism for this demonstration. From a modern perspective, this might seem like priestesses and temples exercising control over kings through religious ideology, and certainly that dynamic existed. Temples held enormous power in Sumerian society, controlled substantial economic resources, and their personnel included learned scribes who maintained and interpreted tradition. But the texts don't frame it as human institutions controlling kings. They frame it as cosmic requirement. The kingship office requires specific conditions to function properly. Those conditions include maintained alignment with divine will, verified through ritual performance. The temples don't control this system, they facilitate it, providing the architecture and procedures through which the necessary connection is maintained. Inanna's choice of Shu-Sin, preserved on Istanbul 2461, wasn't just poetic expression of religious devotion. It was documentation that this king had been chosen, that the ritual had been successfully performed, that legitimacy was renewed for another year. Bridegroom, dear to my heart, not to my political interests, to my heart. The language is intimate because the connection it describes is intimate, not romantic love in the modern sense, but the most direct possible alignment between human vessel and divine authority. The sacred marriage sustained more than fields and flocks. It sustained the connection between heaven and earth. It maintained the channel through which kingship descended. It renewed annually the original conferral of Namlugal that had first occurred when kingship descended to Eridu in the time before memory. And when the texts record that the goddess spoke with the king, that she chose him, that she confirmed him, they weren't describing metaphor or theatre. They were documenting the operation of a system they believed was actually functioning, renewing legitimacy, maintaining authorization, ensuring that earthly governance remained aligned with its cosmic source. Year after year, king after king, city after city, always the same essential right, always the goddess choosing, always the connection renewed, sustaining not just a kingdom, but the kingdom, the cosmic office passed down from antediluvian times, disrupted by flood, re-established by divine descent, and carefully maintained through precisely executed ritual for as long as the system remained intact. The worlds sustained weren't just earthly kingdoms, they were the properly aligned relationship between heaven and earth, human and divine, cosmic order and earthly governance, sustained by marriage, renewed by choice, maintained by the ritual that brought God and king together in the innermost chamber of the temple, where boundaries dissolved and the system was verified operational for another year. The descent protocol. Inanna stood at the outer gate of the underworld. Queen of heaven, goddess of love and war, she had descended from her celestial realm, passed through the upper world, and now approached the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, who ruled the land of no return. The myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld exists in multiple versions across several tablets, compiled by scholars into composite texts. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature provides a standard translation based on manuscripts from various periods. The story is compelling as mythology, sibling rivalry, divine pride, transformation through suffering, death and resurrection. But read carefully, it's also something else. It's a procedural document. Inanna approaches the underworld gate and demands entry. This is already unusual. The dead enter the underworld, and occasionally living heroes descend on specific quests. Gods don't typically visit. Inanna's stated reason varies between versions. She claims to attend funeral rites for Ereshkigal's husband, or she simply desires to extend her dominion over this final realm. The gatekeeper Neti reports Inanna's arrival to Ereshkigal. The underworld queen is not pleased, but she doesn't refuse entry. Instead, she gives specific instructions. Let Inanna enter, but according to the ancient rites. Let the 7 gates of the underworld be opened to her one by one, and at each gate let something be removed from her. This is where the text becomes procedural. There are exactly 7 gates. At each gate, exactly 1 item must be removed. The sequence is specified. At the first gate, Neti removes Inanna's crown, the Shugura, crown of the steppe. At the second gate, he takes her lapis lazuli measuring rod and line. At the third gate, her necklace of lapis lazuli beads. At the fourth gate, the twin stones at her breast. At the fifth gate, her golden ring. At the sixth gate, her lapis lazuli breastplate. At the seventh gate, her royal robe. Inanna enters the underworld throne room stripped of everything. She protests, "What is this?" At each gate she questions, "Why?" The response is always the same, "Be silent, Inanna." The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. Ereshkigal and the 7 judges of the underworld fix Inanna with the eye of death. She dies. Her corpse is hung on a hook on the wall. Mainstream interpretation treats this as death and rebirth mythology. Inanna's descent represents the agricultural cycle, the goddess of fertility descending into death and eventually being restored. The stripping at the gates represents transformation, the shedding of ego and power that allows genuine death and resurrection. The myth explores themes of power, mortality, and the necessity of accepting limits. All of this is valid mythological interpretation. The stories certainly function this way in Sumerian religious understanding, but there's that procedural precision again. 7 gates, specific items, specified sequence, ancient rites that must be followed exactly. What if the myth preserves memory of an actual procedure, not a literal descent to a literal underworld, but a procedural requirement for those who possessed certain divine powers, the me, to demonstrate understanding that those powers could be completely stripped away. Inanna descended with the full complement of her authority: crown, measuring rod of judgment and truth, necklace of fetus, stones, possibly symbols of cosmic powers, ring, breastplate, royal robe, rule of Rub. These aren't random possessions. They're specifically the symbols and implements of divine authority, and they must be surrendered, all of them, in sequence, at designated points, according to ancient procedure. Consider what this means in the context of the me. We've established that the me were understood as transferable powers or procedures. When Inanna acquired them from Enki, she gained capabilities she could implement. Those capabilities came with implements: the crown, the throne, the rod of judgment, and others. What if the descent myth describes the reversibility procedure, a protocol for stripping away the me, demonstrating that they can be fully removed, that no divine power is inherent or inalienable? The 7 gates might represent 7 categories of divine authority. At each gate, one category is removed. The progression is systematic, moving from outer symbols to inner powers, the zones at her breast, possibly representing heart or essence. By the 7th gate, nothing remains. Inanna enters Ereshkigal's realm with no authority, no protection, no power, just consciousness in a body. Then she dies. Even consciousness and body are removed. The complete dissolution of the divine presence. But the procedure includes rescue. Before descending, Inanna had instructed her vizier Ninshubur about what to do if she failed to return. After 3 days, Ninshubur goes to the gods, pleading for Inanna's rescue. Enki, keeper of wisdom, responds. He creates 2 beings from the dirt under his fingernails, gives them the food and water of life, and sends them into the underworld. These creatures aren't warriors. They don't fight. They use empathy. They find Ereshkigal in agony. The text describes her in pain like a woman giving birth, but not giving birth. They mirror her cries, sympathizing with her suffering. Moved by their compassion, Ereshkigal offers them a gift. They request Inanna's corpse. They sprinkle the food and water of life on Inanna's body. She rises. She ascends through the 7 gates. As she passes each gate, her removed items are returned. Crown, measuring rod, necklace, stones, ring, breastplate, robe. She emerges from the underworld fully restored. But there's a condition. No one leaves the underworld empty. Someone must take Inanna's place. She ascends accompanied by demons who will drag a substitute down. When she returns to the upper world and finds her consort Dumuzid not mourning but sitting on her throne, her anger flares. She fixes him with the eye of death, the same eye that killed her. The demons seize Dumuzid and drag him to the underworld. The myth has a coda. Dumuzid's sister Geshtinanna offers to share his fate. They arrange a compromise. Dumuzid will remain in the underworld for half the year, Geshtinanna for the other half. The substitution becomes cyclical. Now the standard agricultural interpretation makes sense. Dumuzid, the shepherd god associated with vegetation, descends for part of the year and returns. His sister substitutes during the alternate period. The cycle explains seasons. But there's that procedural precision underlying the mythological narrative. The descent must follow exact protocol. The 7 gates, the sequential removal, the complete stripping, the death, the proper rescue procedure, the required substitution, the cyclical continuation. What if this was understood as describing how the me system operates at its deepest level? The powers are transferable, yes. They can be given, as Enki gave them to Inanna, but they're also removable. They can be completely stripped away according to proper procedure, even from a major deity. Even the Queen of Heaven can be reduced to nothing according to ancient rites. This would serve as safeguard. If the me could be given but never removed, the system could be corrupted. Power could accumulate without accountability. But if even divine beings must demonstrate submission to the stripping procedure, if anyone who holds the me must acknowledge they're subject to removal, then authority is always conditioned. The underworld serves as the enforcing mechanism. You can accumulate all the powers you want in the upper realm. You can trick Enki into giving you the me, you can transport them to your city, you can implement them, but you remain subject to the descent protocol. And if you descend without following procedure, or if you're required to descend, the ancient rites will strip everything away. Ereshkigal's statement that the ways of the underworld are perfect and may not be questioned suggests these protocols aren't arbitrary. They're fundamental to the system's operation. The upper realm allows transfer, creativity, implementation. The underworld enforces accountability, removal, reset. For kings claiming divine authority through the me of kingship, this myth would serve as warning. Yes, Namlugal can be held. Yes, the me of kingship grants legitimate authority. But that authority is conditional. It can be stripped away according to procedure. Even the greatest divine powers can be reduced to nothing. Death comes for gods and kings alike. The myth also explains the sacred marriage's significance in New Light. Dumuzid must descend to the underworld cyclically, but Dumuzid is the god the king represents in the sacred marriage. The king ritually becomes Dumuzid. Does the ceremony serve not just to renew authority, but to enact the safe version of the descent protocol? The king ritually unifies with the goddess, demonstrating maintained connection. This prevents the forced descent, the stripping by underworld protocol, the replacement by substitute, annual ritual renewal versus catastrophic removal. As long as the king maintains proper procedure, demonstrates continued divine favour through the sacred marriage, performs the rituals correctly, he avoids the underworld's claim. But fail to maintain procedure, lose divine authorization, and the ancient rites activate. Kingship is stripped, another vessel is chosen, the cycle continues. The descent myth would then function as both explanation and warning. Explanation. This is how divine powers operate. Transferable, but also removable, granted but also conditional, subject to protocols that precede any individual holder's claim. Warning: maintain the system correctly or face systematic removal. Inanna's successful navigation of the descent procedure, entering according to ancient rites, accepting the stripping, enduring death, being rescued by proper procedure, ascending with restoration, demonstrates the protocol works both ways. Submit to it correctly and you can be restored. Resist it and you're hung on a hook as a corpse. For a civilization that understood governance through the lens of cosmic office, temporarily held, requiring maintained authorization, this myth would be critically important. It describes the boundary conditions. It reveals the enforcement mechanism. It shows that no authority is absolute, no power permanent, no holder exempt from the ancient procedures. The seven gates stand. The protocol awaits. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned, but they can be navigated. They can be survived. If you remember the procedure, if you accept the stripping, if you maintain proper connection with those who hold the food and water of life. The descent protocol remains encoded in the myth, preserved across tablets and centuries, describing safeguards built into a system that claimed to govern the relationship between heaven and earth. Procedural documentation, masked in mythological narrative, waiting for someone to recognize what it actually describes. When gods gave laws. The fragments of the stele are scattered across museums now, pieces held in the University Museum in Philadelphia, the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and the Louvre. Together, they preserve the oldest known law code, the Code of Ur-Nammu, from approximately 2100 BCE. The stele's upper register shows King Ur-Nammu standing before the seated sun god Shamash. The god extends his hand, holding a rod and ring, ancient symbols of measurement, justice, and divine authority. Ur-Nammu receives them. His posture indicates acceptance, not negotiation. The accompanying text makes the relationship explicit. The prologue describes how Ur-Nammu was chosen by the gods and an Enlil to restore justice after a period of corruption. He's not described as deciding to reform the legal system, he's described as being commissioned to implement divine justice. The laws that follow aren't his innovations, they're the standards he's been authorized to enforce. This pattern appears across ancient Near Eastern law codes. The Code of Hammurabi, several centuries later, shows nearly identical imagery. The king standing before the sun god, receiving the legal standards he'll implement. The Code of Lipitishtar, roughly contemporary with Ur-Nammu, uses similar framing language. Even the biblical legal codes describe Moses receiving law on Sinai written by divine hand. The mainstream interpretation is straightforward. Ancient rulers legitimized their laws by claiming divine origin. Human-made legal standards were presented as divinely revealed to enhance their authority and discourage violation. The imagery and language serve political purposes, grounding human legislation in religious framework. This is almost certainly correct at one level. Law codes with divine sanction would be harder to challenge or modify. If the king is merely enforcing what the gods decreed, opposition becomes sacrilege rather than political disagreement. But look at what Ur-Nammu's code actually contains. The laws themselves are sophisticated, assuming complex society with established economy, property rights, standardized currency, and functioning courts. They distinguish between different types of harm, proportionate responses, and circumstances that modify culpability. Law 1. If a man commits a murder, that man must be put to death. Law 2. If a man commits a robbery, he will be killed. Law 3. If a man commits a kidnapping, he is to be imprisoned and pay 15 shekels of silver. The laws continue through dozens of specific scenarios. Injuries receive compensation rather than retaliatory harm. If you break someone's bone, you pay 1 silver mina. If you cut off someone's nose, you pay 2/3 of a silver mina. If you cause a man's tooth to fall out, you pay 2 shekels of silver. This is remarkably progressive. Instead of eye for eye, tooth for tooth retaliation, Ur-Nammu's code establishes monetary compensation. The values are standardized, suggesting prior agreement on what constitutes just compensation for various injuries. Courts must exist to adjudicate disputes and enforce penalties. Economic infrastructure must support payment in standardized weights of silver. None of this emerges instantly when a new king decides to reform justice. This is a fully developed legal system, assuming considerable social infrastructure. Where did it come from? The text says, from the gods, through the king. Ur-Nammu receives standards he's authorized to implement. The standards themselves, what constitutes justice, how to measure proportionate response, how to balance individual rights with social order, these already exist. They're transmitted to the king, who makes them operational in earthly realm. The rod and ring Shamash extends are significant. The rod represents measurement, the ability to evaluate, to weigh claims, to determine truth. The ring represents authority to enforce, to close judgment, to bind decision, to complete the judicial process. Together, they symbolize complete judicial power, to determine what is just and to enforce that determination. But notice, these aren't created for Ur-Nammu, they're given to him. Shamash already possesses them. The sun god holds jurisdiction over justice as his cosmic function. What Ur-Nammu receives is authority to execute that function in human society. This parallels the me system we've explored. Just as Nam-Lugal is the cosmic office of kingship, separate from any individual king, so the me of justice, the procedural knowledge of how to implement fair law, exists independently of any particular legal code. Ur-Nammu receives and implements it. He doesn't invent it. The laws themselves show this. Many scholars note that legal codes across ancient Mesopotamia share similar structures and sometimes identical provisions, despite coming from different kingdoms and periods. The Code of Ur-Nammu, Code of Lipitishtar, Laws of Eshnunna, Code of Hammurabi, these aren't entirely independent compositions. They're variations on common legal tradition, each ruler implementing and sometimes modifying inherited standards. This is exactly what you'd expect if the legal system was understood as received rather than invented. Received traditions get transmitted, implemented, and adapted by different rulers in different circumstances. But the core structure remains recognizable because it derives from common source. What was that source? The texts say divine. Shamash gives the law, but Shamash himself is described as executing cosmic justice, maintaining order in the divine realm. The sun god sees everything under the sun. Nothing is hidden. His all-seeing nature makes him the appropriate divine authority for justice. But the texts don't describe Shamash inventing justice. He embodies it, executes it, transmits it. The procedural similarity to how the me are described is striking. Justice, like kingship, like priesthood, like crafts and arts, is one of the me given by Enki to Inanna in the drunken gift exchange. It exists as discrete element of civilization, transferable, implementable, part of the complete package of cultural knowledge. If the me were understood as procedural knowledge, the instructions for how to implement various aspects of civilization, then the me of justice would contain something like the principles we see in Unamu's code. Not necessarily the specific penalty amounts, which might vary by circumstance and economy, but the underlying principles, proportionate response, distinction between capital and lesser crimes, compensation for harm, protection of vulnerable populations. The Code of Ur-Nammu includes laws protecting widows and orphans, preventing the powerful from exploiting the weak, ensuring fair treatment in economic transactions. These aren't just criminal statutes. They're principles of social order, of how society should function to reflect cosmic justice in earthly relationships. Where would such principles come from? One answer, from long experience. Human societies discover through trial and error what legal arrangements produce stability. Successful principles get preserved and transmitted. This is how comparative law scholars generally explain legal tradition, its accumulated wisdom refined across generations. But the ancient Mesopotamians would have disagreed with this developmental model. They believed the principles of justice were received, not discovered. Society works when it aligns with cosmic order. Cosmic order exists prior to human society. Therefore, the principles must be received from those who understand cosmic order, the gods, and implemented by those authorized to execute them, divinely sanctioned kings. This creates interesting practical implications. If law comes from the gods, does it ever change? Can kings modify it? The evidence suggests yes, different codes have different provisions, but modifications are always framed as restoring proper justice after a period of corruption, or adapting eternal principles to current circumstances, never as innovation or improvement on divine wisdom. Ur-Nammu's prologue explicitly states that he's restoring justice after his predecessor had allowed corruption. He's not inventing new laws. He's cleaning up the system, removing officials who perverted justice, re-establishing proper standards. His role is restorative, not creative. This is the same framework we've seen repeatedly. Kingship descended from heaven, it's not invented. The me were given by Enki, they're not developed. Temple architecture follows divine pattern, it's not designed. Law comes from the gods, it's not legislated. Consistently, across every domain, the Sumerians framed civilization as received, transmitted, preserved, and correctly implemented rather than invented, developed, and improved. This isn't just rhetorical flourish or political propaganda. This is a comprehensive worldview about the nature of knowledge, authority, and order. Modern civilization assumes progress. We believe we improve on the past through innovation and discovery. We assume earlier societies were more primitive, their knowledge more limited, their capabilities more constrained. Our trajectory is developmental, from simple to complex, from ignorant to knowledgeable, from primitive to advanced. The Sumerian worldview was precisely opposite. They believed the most important knowledge had been transmitted in the distant past. Their role was preservation and correct implementation, not innovation. Civilization wasn't progressing, it was being maintained against constant threats of corruption and forgetting. When Unamu stands before Shamash, receiving the rod and ring, the scene depicts this worldview in visual form. The human king receives authority from divine source. He doesn't generate that authority himself. His legitimacy derives entirely from maintained connection with the source. Break that connection, and his commands lose cosmic sanction. They become merely human will enforced by human power, valid until a stronger power displaces them. But commands issued under proper authority, in alignment with cosmic justice, carry more than human enforcement. They carry the weight of divine order itself. To violate them isn't just to break human law, it's to violate the fundamental structures of reality, to place yourself in opposition to cosmic order. This is why the receiving imagery matters so much. It's not just legitimizing propaganda, it's documenting the claim that these laws align with something beyond human preference. Whether that claim is true, we can't verify, but we can recognize that the Sumerians structured their entire legal system around maintaining this alignment. They preserved the codes in stone, carved carefully, displayed publicly. They trained judges in proper interpretation. They maintained courts that could adjudicate complex disputes. They developed legal procedures, testimony, evidence, oaths, ordeals to determine truth when facts were disputed. All of this infrastructure served to implement what they believed had been given. The me of justice, transmitted through proper channels, executed by authorized agents, creating earthly reflection of cosmic order. When gods gave laws, in their understanding, they weren't making arbitrary rules. They were transmitting operating principles, the procedures by which human society could align with fundamental reality. Follow them, and order emerges. Violate them, and chaos returns. Ur-Nammu received the rod and ring. He implemented justice. The stele preserving his laws was erected publicly so people could know the standards by which they'd be judged. Not standards he invented, but standards he'd been authorized to execute, received, transmitted, preserved, implemented. The same pattern applied to law that governed every aspect of Sumerian civilization. The warrior's cosmic mandate. The myth known as Lugal-e, from its opening words, Lugal-e ad Meambin King, the storm with your terrifying radiance, tells of the warrior god Ninurta's battle against the rebellious stone demons of the mountains. The text spans over 700 lines, preserved on tablets from multiple periods, clearly considered important enough to copy and preserve across centuries. The narrative begins with chaos threatening cosmic order. The Asaj demon, together with an army of stones from the mountains, rebels against the god's authority. These aren't metaphorical stones. The text names them Ushumgal stone, Saga stone, Anzud stone, each specific rock type with particular attributes. They rise in rebellion, threatening to overwhelm the ordered world. Ninurta, warrior god and son of Enlil, receives the mandate to restore order. He arms himself with divine weapons, each named and described. The Shurur mace that can speak and scout ahead. The flood weapon, the weapon of 50 heads. These aren't generic mythological weapons. They're specific implements with particular functions, as precisely catalogued as the stones they'll fight. The battle is fierce and protracted. Ninurta faces the Asag demon in single combat. The text describes the stone demons supporting the Asag, forming a great wall that threatens to dam the Tigris itself. If they succeed, water won't reach the lowlands. Civilization will perish. Ninurta prevails. He defeats the Asag. He scatters the stone demon army. Then comes the interesting part, the judgment. Ninurta doesn't simply destroy his enemies. He judges each stone according to its conduct during the rebellion. Those that fought against him receive curses. They'll be broken for grinding, used for tools, trampled underfoot. Those that supported him or remained neutral received blessings. They'll become precious stones, worn by priests, valued by craftsmen, used in sacred contexts. The text provides specific judgments for dozens of stone types: diorite, blessed, made suitable for statues of kings and gods; lapis lazuli, blessed, made precious for adornment; gypsum, cursed, made common for building; asphalt, cursed, used for waterproofing. On and on, a comprehensive inventory of Mesopotamian minerals and their properties, framed as consequences of cosmic battle. Mainstream interpretation treats Lugol as etiological myth. It explains why certain stones are precious and others common, why specific minerals have particular uses, why the landscape has mountains and valleys. The battle narrative provides entertaining theology while encoding practical knowledge about geology and resources. This is reasonable. The myth certainly serves these explanatory functions. But there's that procedural detail again. Why catalogue every stone type? Why specify their uses so precisely? Why frame the warrior god's victory in terms of cosmic judgment and establishment of eternal order? Let's look at what Ninurta actually does in the myth. He receives mandate from Enlil to restore order. He receives specific weapons designed for this task. He executes the mission. He judges the elements involved, establishing permanent categories of use and value. He returns to Enlil, who confirms his victory and bestows further honours. This is a procedural framework for establishing cosmic order through authorised force. Ninurta isn't acting autonomously. He's executing a specific commission from the chief god. His authority to wage this battle, to judge these stones, to reorganise this aspect of reality, all derived from his mandate. The text calls him King's Arm. Ninurta is the executor of divine authority, the enforcer of cosmic order when rebellion threatens the system. His role parallels the human king's role in maintaining earthly order through authorized force. Consider the name the text gives him, Lugol. Ninurta is called king throughout the epic, though he's Enlil's son, not supreme deity. This is Nam-Lugol again, not describing Ninurta's inherent nature, but his cosmic office. He holds the kingship function in the realm of warriors and enforcement. The me of kingship, we've established, includes authority to maintain order. That authority sometimes requires force. The human king had warrior function, defending the city, suppressing rebellion, maintaining boundaries. But that force was legitimate only when exercised under proper authority, in alignment with cosmic order. Lugol describes the divine template for this function. When chaos threatens order, the holder of Nam-Lugol receives mandate from ultimate authority, Enlil for Ninurta, the gods for human kings. He arms himself with appropriate implements. He executes the mission according to procedure. He judges outcomes, establishing order. He returns to the authority who commissioned him, who confirms success. This is how authorized force operates. Not arbitrary violence, but systematic execution of commissioned order maintenance. The detailed judgment scene matters because it shows force serving justice. The stones that actively rebelled receive harsh judgment. Those that remained loyal receive blessing. Those that were neutral receive proportionate treatment. The parallel to human kingship would be explicit for Sumerian audiences. When a king went to war, he claimed divine commission. The gods had mandated this campaign to restore order, suppress rebellion, or defend cosmic justice. The king's violence was presented not as aggression, but as execution of divine will. Before major campaigns, kings consulted omens. They performed divination to determine if the gods authorized the proposed action. Favorable omens meant the campaign had divine mandate. Unfavorable omens meant the gods withheld authorization. Proceeding anyway would be acting without legitimate authority. This system created constraints on raw violence. You couldn't just attack whenever you wanted. You needed divine mandate, confirmed through proper procedure. Priests controlled access to divination procedures. Unfavorable omens could stop campaigns, force delays, or limit objectives. Ninurta's battle against the Asag provided mythological precedent for this constrained use of force. Even divine warrior must receive mandate. Even cosmic battles must serve order rather than personal ambition. Even victory must be followed by judgment that establishes just outcomes rather than arbitrary dominance. The reorganization of stones, assigning value and use to each type, mirrors the king's role in organizing society, assigning roles, establishing hierarchies, determining who serves which function. But this organization isn't arbitrary. It's based on conduct, on alignment with cosmic order, on proper response to authority. After the judgment, Ninurta dams the mountain waters, creating controlled channels for irrigation. The text describes this in detail. Water that had threatened chaos is now harnessed for agricultural productivity. Destruction is transformed into provision. The battle's outcome benefits civilization. This is the ideal of divine kingship. Violence, when necessary, must serve ultimately constructive purposes. The warrior king destroys chaos to enable order. He defeats enemies to establish peace. He exercises force to create conditions for prosperity. The text concludes with Ninurta receiving honours from his mother Ninlil and his father Enlil. He is blessed with specific powers and authorities. His weapons are given eternal names. His victory is established as permanent precedent. Cosmic order is confirmed, and Ninurta's role as executor of that order is formalized. Human kings participating in annual New Year festivals sometimes ritually enacted portions of the Lugal-E narrative. The king played Ninurta's role, reenacting the cosmic battle, demonstrating his function as enforcer of divine order. The ritual performance connected the king's earthly authority to Ninurta's cosmic mandate. This wasn't just theatre, it was procedural verification. Just as the sacred marriage verified the king's connection to Inanna, the Lugal-E enactment verified his connection to Ninurta, his authorization to use force, his mandate to maintain order, his function as warrior king executing divine will. The Me of kingship included warrior function. That function operated under strict procedural constraints. The Lugal-E myth encoded those constraints in narrative form: receive mandate, use appropriate implements, execute with precision, judge outcomes, establish order, return to authority for confirmation. Follow the procedure, and violence serves cosmic justice. Violate the procedure, and you're just another rebellious force that will eventually face judgment, like the Asag demon. The warrior's cosmic mandate wasn't blank check for aggression. It was precisely bounded authorization, transmitted through proper channels, executed according to established patterns, always ultimately accountable to higher authority. Ninurta returned to his father after victory. Human kings, holding his cosmic office in earthly realm, understood themselves as similarly accountable. Their force was borrowed, delegated, conditioned or maintained alignment with divine order. The myth preserved the template. The ritual enacted the verification. The king held the mandate only as long as the system confirmed his authorization. When chaos threatened, the king could wage war, but only under proper mandate, only with divine authorization, only in service to cosmic order. The warrior's mandate was cosmic because it derived from cosmos. Lose that connection, and the warrior becomes the chaos he was commissioned to suppress, the kings who became gods. Around 2095 BC, something unprecedented occurred in Sumerian history. King Shulgi of Ur, during the 20th year of his reign, declared himself divine. Not semi-divine, not divinely blessed, not chosen by gods, divine himself, worthy of worship, recipient of sacrifices, deserving of temples. Before Shulgi, Mesopotamian kings were human. They claimed divine sanction. They received authorization from gods. They executed divine will. But they remained human vessels temporarily holding cosmic office. After death, they joined ancestors in the underworld like any mortal. Shulgi changed this. His name began appearing in texts with the divine determinative. The cuneiform sign indicating the following name refers to a god. Temples were dedicated to him during his lifetime. Priests offered sacrifices to his divine presence. Hymns addressed him with the same language used for gods. This practice continued through the Ur III dynasty, 2112-2004. Shulgi's successor Amar-Sin was deified. So was Shu-Sin, whom we met in the sacred marriage text. So was the last king of the dynasty, Ibi-Sin. For roughly a century, the kings of Ur were worshipped as living gods. Then the practice stopped. The Ur-Thori dynasty collapsed around 2004 BC under combined pressure from Elamite invasion and internal rebellion. Subsequent Mesopotamian kings returned to the earlier model, divinely authorized humans, not divine beings themselves. The living king as god experiment ended as abruptly as it had begun. Mainstream scholarly interpretation frames this as political innovation. Shulgi established an empire more extensive than previous Sumerian kingdoms. He needed stronger ideological justification for centralized power over diverse regions. Deification served this purpose. If the king isn't just authorized by gods, but is himself divine, then obedience to his commands becomes religious duty, not just civic obligation. When the empire collapsed, the ideological justification collapsed with it. Successor states returned to traditional models because the deification had been tied to Ur's political dominance. Without the empire, the claim rang hollow. This interpretation is well supported by historical context. Shulgi did expand Uri's power significantly. He did develop sophisticated administrative systems to govern the expanded territory. Deification did provide ideological support for these claims. But let's look more carefully at how the deification was presented. Shulgi's royal hymns describe his divinity in very specific terms. He doesn't claim to have become different in nature. He claims that the gods have bestowed divinity upon him as a gift, similar to how they bestowed kingship. In Shulgi B, one of the most extensive hymns, Shulgi describes receiving divine powers from various gods. Each god gives him specific attributes. Enlil gives him kingship and authority. Nana gives him the crown. Inanna gives him warrior prowess and love. Then the text states, "The gods made my name secure. They made my name equal to theirs." This is bestow language, not transformation language. The gods made him divine. They elevated his status. They extended divinity to him as a gift, the way they'd previously given him kingship. If we apply the me framework, this makes sense. Divinity might be one of the me, a transferable attribute or office, just as Nam Lugal was a cosmic office that could be bestowed on humans, so divinity itself might be transferable under specific circumstances. Remember that the me includes seemingly contradictory elements, lordship and subordination, truth and falsehood, construction and destruction. What if divinity is also among the me? Not that humans can become gods in the sense of gaining absolute power, but that the attribute of divinity, worthy of worship, recipient of cult, channel for divine presence, could be transferred to a human vessel under proper conditions. The conditions would be critical. Not any king could claim divinity. It had to be bestowed by divine authority. The texts consistently present Shulgi's deification as something done to him, not something he claimed for himself. The gods decided to elevate him. They made him divine. Why would gods do this? One interpretation, Shulgi's success as king demonstrated such complete alignment with divine will that the gods extended full partnership to him. He wasn't just executing their commands, he embodied their presence so completely that the distinction dissolved. This would make deification the ultimate expression of successful divine kingship. Most kings held Nam Lugal, the cosmic office connecting them to divine authority. A few exceptional kings held it so completely, executed it so faithfully, maintained alignment so perfectly, that they became vessels for divine presence itself. Nicole Brish, scholar of Mesopotamian religion, has examined III divine kingship extensively. Her analysis suggests the deification served specific cultic purposes related to maintaining cosmic order. The deified king became pivot point connecting divine and human realms, similar to temple architecture but in human form. If the temple was cosmic axis, the architectural connection between heaven and earth, perhaps the deified king served analogous function in political realm. His person became the connection point. Worship of him wasn't political theatre, it was maintaining the necessary connection for cosmic order to flow through into earthly governance. This would explain why the practice was so carefully controlled. Only certain kings of one dynasty, and only after demonstrating successful rule for years. Shulgi reigned for 48 years. His deification came after proving his capability. The gods didn't make him divine upon accession. They elevated him after sustained demonstration of successful cosmic alignment. It would also explain why the practice ended with the dynasty's collapse. If deification depended on maintained cosmic order and the empire's fall demonstrated loss of divine favour, then subsequent kings couldn't credibly claim the gods had bestowed divinity on them. The system had failed. Divinity was withdrawn, just as kingship could be taken from one city and given to another. The Sumerian king list doesn't record the Ur-3 kings as ruling extraordinarily long periods. Shulgi, 48 years. Amar-Sin, 9 years. Shu-Sin, 9 years. Ibi-Sin, 24 years. These are plausible human lifespans. Deification didn't grant biological immortality or impossible longevity. It granted cultic status, ritual function, symbolic role as divine presence in human realm. After Ibi-Sin's fall, no Mesopotamian king successfully claimed living divinity again. A few tried. Naram-Sin of Akkad had attempted deification centuries earlier, but his empire also collapsed, and later traditions viewed his claim as hubris, punished by gods. The pattern held, deification required not just royal claim, but sustained divine authorization demonstrated through successful rule and eventual validation by other states. What if the Ur-3 experiment was attempting to implement something from deeper tradition? What if the antediluvian kings, those impossibly long-reigning figures from before the flood, had been understood as deified humans, not biological immortals, but humans who'd achieved complete alignment with cosmic order and therefore held divine status? This is speculation, but it would explain the pattern. Before the flood, kings were divine or semi-divine, reigned for enormous periods, embodied complete alignment with heaven. The flood disrupted this. Post-flood kings were human, holding delegated authority, requiring maintained connection through ritual. Then Shulgi achieved sufficient alignment that the gods restored the older pattern, divine kingship, in the fuller sense, where the king becomes divine presence. But the restoration was temporary. Only one dynasty maintained it, and only for a century. Whatever conditions enabled antediluvian divine kingship no longer existed in stable form. The system had degraded. The best that could be achieved was temporary restoration, carefully controlled, dependent on specific circumstances that eventually failed. After Ur-3 collapsed, Mesopotamian kingship returned to the intermediary model permanently. Kings were human. They received authorization from gods. They maintained connection through ritual. But they didn't become gods. That capability had been lost, or had been tried and found unsustainable in current conditions. The texts preserving this experiment tell us several things. First, the Sumerians believed divinity was transferable under specific conditions. Second, they believed this had been done successfully in their recent past. Third, they believed it ultimately failed, requiring return to earlier models. Fourth, they considered the experiment important enough to document extensively. Dozens of hymns, administrative texts, and theological compositions reference the divine kings. This wasn't forgotten or suppressed. It was preserved as precedent, evidence that full divine kingship had been attempted, achieved temporarily, but couldn't be sustained. The question of why not would occupy Mesopotamian theological speculation for subsequent centuries. Was the cosmos itself degrading, making complete divine-human alignment progressively more difficult? Had critical knowledge been lost despite preservation efforts? Were humans becoming less capable of holding divine presence? Had the gods withdrawn certain possibilities? The texts don't provide clear answers. What they preserve is the pattern: divine kingship achieved, divine kingship lost, divine kingship partially restored, divine kingship lost again. Each iteration slightly diminished, each restoration temporary, the trajectory pointing toward progressive separation of divine and human realms. The kings who became gods demonstrated it was possible. Their dynasty's collapse demonstrated it wasn't sustainable. The tradition preserved both achievements and limitations, documenting humanity's furthest successful reach toward complete alignment with cosmic order and its inevitable return to more constrained conditions. Shulgi ruled for 48 years as divine king. His hymns describe absolute authority, perfect justice, universal adoration. His administrative records show efficient governance, extensive building projects, maintained stability. Then his successors reigned for progressively shorter periods. Then the empire fragmented. Then foreign powers invaded. Then the dynasty ended. The gods had made his name equal to theirs, but only temporarily, only under specific conditions, only within the constraints of a degrading system that could approximate but not fully restore what had been lost when the flood swept over the land and the antediluvian pattern was broken. The knowledge keepers. Step back. Look at the pattern. Before the flood, kingship descends from heaven to Eridu, city of Enki the wisdom keeper. 8 kings rule through periods represented by impossibly large numbers. The system operates continuously until catastrophic disruption. After the flood, kingship descends again, this time to Kish. Post-Diluvian kings rule for progressively shorter periods. The Me of civilization, preserved through Enki's warning to Ziusudra, enable reconstruction. Cities are rebuilt. Knowledge is implemented. The system continues, but it's more fragile. The architectural template, temples built according to revealed specifications, oriented with astronomical precision, reconstructed repeatedly in the same pattern. Ziggurats create connection between heaven and earth. The physical infrastructure maintains cosmic alignment. The ritual template, sacred marriage, annually renews the king's authorization. Divination procedures verify divine support before major decisions. Omens confirm or deny authorization. Temple personnel maintain the procedures that keep the connection operational. The procedural template mirrors transferable components of civilization, held by some, given to others, implemented through proper knowledge. Namlugal as cosmic office, descended from heaven, bestowed on authorized vessels, maintained through ritual alignment. Laws received from a divine realm, implemented by authorized kings, creating earthly reflection of cosmic justice. The enforcement template, 7 gates where powers can be stripped according to ancient rites. Underworld protocols that remove authority from those who violate procedure. Substitution requirements ensuring no one escapes accountability. Cyclical patterns of descent and restoration. The warrior template, divine mandate, required before authorized force. Weapons serving order, not chaos. Judgment following victory, establishing just outcomes. Return to authority for confirmation of success. The experimental template, Earth-3 kings achieving temporary deification, demonstrating restored complete alignment. The experiment's failure, requiring return to intermediary models. The documentation preserving both achievement and limitation. Every template interconnected. Every procedure referencing others. The whole system forming comprehensive framework for maintaining alignment between divine order and human society. What if the Sumerians were right that this was inherited knowledge, not invented by them, but received, preserved and transmitted, not developed incrementally, but implemented according to patterns they'd been given? The conventional developmental model says civilization emerges gradually. Hunter-gatherers settle into agriculture. Agricultural surplus enables specialization. Specialization creates complexity. Complexity requires administration. Administration develops writing. Writing enables law, literature, and theology, each stage building on previous, innovations accumulating, society progressing from simple to complex over millennia. This model fits archaeological evidence reasonably well. We can trace pottery development, architectural evolution, technological advancement. We see gradual elaboration of social structures. The progression from Neolithic villages to Bronze Age cities spans thousands of years, with identifiable intermediate stages. But the Sumerian texts consistently describe their civilization differently. They don't describe development, they describe implementation of received knowledge. They don't credit human inventors, they credit divine sources. They don't celebrate innovation. They celebrate faithful preservation and correct execution. Why the disconnect? Why do the texts insist on received knowledge while the archaeology suggests gradual development? One possibility: the texts are simply wrong, products of pre-scientific understanding that attributed natural developments to supernatural origins. Ancient people didn't understand cultural evolution, so they mythologized it. The gods gave civilization because they couldn't imagine civilization emerging through natural processes. Another possibility: the texts and archaeology are describing different things. Archaeology tracks material development, physical evidence of technology, architecture, and economy evolving over time. The texts track knowledge transmission, claims about where the organizing principles came from, independent of when physical implementation occurred. These aren't necessarily contradictory. A culture could gradually develop physical capabilities, better pottery, larger buildings, more complex tools, while believing that the organizing principles for using those capabilities came from external source. The me wouldn't be physical things that arrive suddenly. They'd be knowledge, procedural understanding of how to organize society, how to implement governance, how to maintain cosmic alignment. That knowledge could have been transmitted, or believed to have been transmitted, before the physical capability to fully implement it existed. The Sumerians might have possessed the me conceptually long before they had cities, writing, and monumental architecture. When those physical capabilities developed, they implemented the me they'd already received. This would explain the apparent disconnect. The me descend to Eridu early in the tradition, but Eridu's archaeological record shows gradual development from simple shrine to elaborate temple complex over thousands of years. These aren't contradictory if the me represent knowledge transmitted early and implemented gradually as material capabilities allowed. Under this interpretation, the Sumerian self-understanding wasn't delusional. They possessed organizing principles whose origin wasn't traceable to human innovation within their historical memory. These principles predated their physical civilization. When they built cities and temples, they were implementing pre-existing knowledge, not inventing new forms. Where did that knowledge come from? The texts say, from heaven. The gods possessed it. They transmitted it to humans, specifically to Eridu, to Enki, who became keeper and distributor of the me. Can we verify this? No. We have no way to confirm or deny that some external intelligence transmitted organizational knowledge to early human societies. The claim is unfalsifiable. It could be true, or it could be mythological explanation for knowledge whose actual origins were forgotten or never understood. But we can observe that the Sumerians acted as if it were true. They structured their entire civilization around preserving and correctly implementing received knowledge. They copied texts obsessively, ensuring transmission across generations. They built according to precise specifications rather than experimenting with architectural forms. They performed rituals with exact attention to procedure rather than modifying for convenience or preference. This is the behaviour of a culture maintaining a system they believe is critically important and which they don't fully understand. You don't innovate with systems you depend on but don't comprehend. You preserve them. You execute them carefully. You transmit them faithfully. You trust that if you maintain the procedures correctly, the system will continue functioning even if you don't grasp the underlying mechanisms. The knowledge keepers, then, were the scribes, priests, and kings who understood themselves as transmitters rather than creators. Their role was custody, preservation, faithful implementation, training the next generation in proper procedures, copying the texts that encoded the knowledge, performing the rituals that maintained the connections, building the temples according to specifications. This role explains otherwise puzzling aspects of Sumerian culture, the extreme conservatism in temple architecture, repeatedly rebuilding in identical patterns over millennia, the careful copying of texts that may not have been fully understood by the copyists, the anxiety about getting procedures correct, evident in texts like the Gudea cylinders, the emphasis on divine authorization for innovations, however minor. If you believe you're maintaining inherited knowledge whose origins are external to human civilization, you don't casually modify it. You don't assume you can improve on it. You preserve it as carefully as possible and implement it as faithfully as you understand how. This also explains why the Sumerians recorded their failures alongside successes. The antediluvian section, with impossible rain lengths, preserved despite being inexplicable. The flood narrative, preserved though it marks catastrophic disruption of their system. The Year 3 deification experiment, preserved even though it failed. They documented everything because they understood themselves as transmitters to future generations, who might understand what current generations couldn't fully comprehend. They were building an archive, not just of their civilization's history, but of the knowledge that underlay their civilization. The texts, the procedures, the architectural specifications, the ritual instructions, all preserved, fired into clay, stored in temple libraries, copied across generations. When Mesopotamian civilization eventually declined, when Sumerian language ceased being spoken, the archive remained. Buried under sand and ruined cities, the tablets waited. When they were excavated in the 19th and 20th centuries C, they brought us claims that seem impossible. Kingship descended from heaven. The me were given by gods. Divine knowledge was transmitted to human keepers. Civilization isn't human invention, it's human implementation of received instruction. We can dismiss these claims as primitive theology, or we can recognize that the Sumerians themselves were uncertain about origins, which is why they preserved so much documentation. They recorded their own questions alongside their traditions. They acknowledged gaps in understanding. They passed forward both knowledge and uncertainty, trusting future generations to evaluate what they themselves couldn't definitively resolve. The knowledge keepers kept the question open. Kingship descended. From where? From whom? Through what mechanism? They claimed heaven, but didn't fully explain what that meant. They described the me, but didn't reveal their origin. They documented procedures, but acknowledged the procedures serve purposes beyond complete human understanding. What they kept, above all, was the system operational. For 3,000 years, through multiple languages, empires and civilizations, the core patterns transmitted: divine kingship, sacred architecture, ritual maintenance of cosmic connection, law as received standard rather than human invention, knowledge as inherited rather than discovered. The patterns spread from Sumer across Mesopotamia. The Akkadians adopted them. The Babylonians elaborated them. The Assyrians maintained them. They influenced Egypt, Persia, Greece, Rome. Elements of Sumerian cosmic kingship echo through medieval divine right monarchy, through temple architecture worldwide, through legal traditions claiming authority beyond human legislation. The knowledge keepers succeeded in their transmission. The patterns survived. The questions survived. The claim that civilization rests on received knowledge that survive too, encoded in religious traditions that still insist human wisdom derives from sources beyond human origin. Whether that claim is true remains unverifiable. What's verifiable is that believing it true shaped how civilizations understood themselves for thousands of years, and that the alternative, that all knowledge is human discovery, all order is human invention, all meaning is human creation, would have been incomprehensible to those who understood themselves primarily as keepers, transmitters, and faithful implementers of something received from elsewhere. The texts remain, the patterns remain, the question remains. And perhaps that's exactly what the knowledge keepers intended to preserve, the office that remembers. Night has fallen by now, wherever you are, or dawn is approaching, the hours between, when the world settles and the mind quiets, when ancient questions feel less strange, more possible, when the weight of clay tablets in museum vaults seems less like artifacts and more like messages. Return with me to the Ashmolean, to the Weld Blundell prism, to those first lines incised 4,000 years ago. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. We've travelled far from that opening claim, through temples and laws, through marriages and descents, through warriors and gods, through experiments and failures, through the documentation of a civilization that understood itself as keeper of knowledge it hadn't created. What did we find? Not proof. The texts can't prove their claims about divine origin. 4,000 years of dust and silence separate us from the Sumerians who pressed these wedges into clay. We can't verify whether kingship actually descended from anywhere. We can't confirm the me were transmitted rather than developed. We can't validate that cosmic order exists independently of human imagination. But we found something else. We found consistency. Not the consistency of propaganda. Propaganda typically contains contradictions when examined across multiple sources and long time spans. We found the consistency of a functioning system maintained across centuries, implemented by multiple cities and dynasties, preserving the same fundamental patterns despite political fragmentation and cultural change. That consistency suggests the Sumerians weren't simply inventing convenient religious justifications for political power. They were maintaining something they believed was real, something they believed mattered, something they believed would stop working if they didn't preserve and implement it correctly. Nam Lugal, the cosmic office. Not kingship as personal power, but kingship as assigned function, a role temporarily held, requiring maintained authorization subject to withdrawal when alignment failed. What would change if we took this seriously? Not as historical fact necessarily, but as alternative framework for understanding authority. Modern politics assumes authority derives from consent or force. Democratic governments claim legitimacy through elections, authority from below granted by the governed. Authoritarian governments claim legitimacy through power, authority from strength, maintained by control. Both models locate authority's source in human realm. Either human agreement or human domination makes governance legitimate. The Sumerian model proposes something different. Authority derives from alignment. Not alignment with human preferences, but alignment with patterns that exist independently of human will. You can't seize this authority, only receive it. You can't create it, only maintain it. You can't control it, only serve as its vessel. This isn't theology necessarily. Replace divine order with natural law or cosmic principles or fundamental reality, and the framework remains the same. Authority is legitimate when it aligns with something beyond human construction. When that alignment breaks, authority becomes mere power, temporarily effective, ultimately unstable. The Sumerian procedures, the rituals, the divination, the architectural specifications, the legal codes all serve to maintain and verify alignment. They weren't magic ensuring divine favour, they were quality control procedures testing whether the system remained operational. When the sacred marriage was successfully performed, it demonstrated the goddess still chose this king. When omens were favourable, they indicated divine authorization continued. When temples stood according to specification, they maintained the architectural connection. When laws reflected cosmic justice, society operated in alignment. When any of these procedures failed, when ritual went wrong, when omens turned unfavorable, when temples collapsed, when justice perverted, the system signaled misalignment. Authority was failing. Nam-Lugal was withdrawing. Time to correct course, or accept that kingship would transfer elsewhere. This created accountability beyond human enforcement. A king who ruled justly, maintained rituals, built according to specification, and consulted divine, could legitimately hold authority even against powerful opposition. A king who violated these requirements lacked legitimate authority even if he commanded armies and controlled wealth. The knowledge keepers, the scribes and priests who maintained the procedures, served as the system's operators. They weren't creating authority, they were maintaining the infrastructure through which authority could manifest. Kings needed them not because they controlled religious ideology, but because they controlled the procedures that verified legitimate authority. Lose access to the procedures, and you lose ability to demonstrate legitimacy. This is why the texts were so carefully preserved, why temples required such precise reconstruction, why rituals demanded exact performance. The procedures maintained the system. Without them, kingship might continue as mere power, but it wouldn't be Nam-Lugal, the cosmic office connected to its source. When Mesopotamian civilization declined, when cities fell and dynasties ended, the knowledge keepers continued their work. They kept copying texts. They maintained whatever temples survived. They preserved the knowledge of how the system was supposed to function, even when political circumstances prevented proper implementation. Because they understood their role as larger than serving current rulers, they were transmitting to the future, ensuring that even if this kingdom fell, even if this dynasty ended, even if catastrophe came again, as it had with the flood, the next generation would have access to the knowledge needed to rebuild. The tablets they fired and stored in temple libraries were time capsules, not just recording their present, but preserving their past and providing for their future. The knowledge would survive even if the civilization didn't. And it did survive. When 19th century archaeologists excavated Mesopotamian sites, they found libraries. When 20th century scholars deciphered cuneiform, they recovered texts. The knowledge keepers' transmission succeeded across a gap of 2,000 years of silence. The knowledge they preserved became accessible again to civilizations that had forgotten the Sumerians existed. What was transmitted? The claim that kingship descended from heaven. That civilization rests on received knowledge. That authority derives from cosmic alignment. That humans can serve as vessels for something beyond human origin. That the office remembers what the individuals forget. These claims can't be proven. But they also can't be dismissed without confronting why a sophisticated civilization dedicated enormous resources to maintaining them across millennia. Either the Sumerians were engaged in an elaborate collective delusion, or they were preserving understanding of something real that we've lost the framework to recognize. The office that remembers. Nam-Lugal continuing even when individual kings fail. The me preserved even when individual keepers die. The cosmic pattern maintained even when earthly implementations falter. Memory embedded in the structure itself, not dependent on biological continuity. This is the final implication of the Sumerian worldview. Knowledge doesn't have to be continuously rediscovered. It can be preserved across gaps. If the procedures are maintained, if the texts are copied, if the architecture follows specification, then even after catastrophic loss, the system can be restored. Because the system isn't ultimately human. It descended from elsewhere. It exists independently. Humans implement it, but don't originate it. And because the source remains, restoration remains possible, no matter how complete the disruption. The antediluvian kings ruled before the flood. The flood destroyed their civilization. But kingship descended again. The me were preserved through Enki's warning. The knowledge survived. Civilization was rebuilt. The system continued. If that happened once, it could happen again. This is the hope encoded in the Sumerian texts. Not naive optimism, but structural confidence. The office remembers. The knowledge can be recovered. Alignment can be restored. You've listened for hours to these ancient claims. You've heard the evidence from tablets and temples, from laws and hymns, from myths and administrative records. You've seen the pattern of a civilization that understood itself as keeper of inherited knowledge, implementing received procedures, maintaining cosmic alignment through careful preservation and faithful execution. What you do with that is yours to decide. Dismiss it as primitive theology, accept it as hidden truth, hold it as possibility worth considering. The Sumerians would understand any of these responses. They preserved questions alongside answers. They documented uncertainty alongside procedure. They transmitted both knowledge and mystery. The Weld-Blundell prism remains in its climate-controlled case. The cuneiform remains legible. The claim remains clear. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Perhaps it still is. In some form we've forgotten how to recognise. Perhaps the office continues, waiting for vessels who remember the procedures. Perhaps the knowledge keeper's work isn't finished, just waiting for the next generation to understand what was preserved. Or perhaps it's exactly what it appears. Remarkable human civilization, sophisticated religious thought, elaborate political ideology, preserving impressive cultural achievements through poetry and myth. Either way, they succeeded in making you think about it. 4,000 years later, in the quiet hours, you're contemplating whether kingship descended from heaven, whether knowledge can be inherited rather than discovered, whether cosmic order exists independently of human construction, whether alignment with something beyond ourselves is possible or necessary or real. The knowledge keepers transmitted these questions successfully. They're with you now, in the silent hours as they intended. Rest with them. Let the patterns settle. The ancient world is patient. The questions remain. The office remembers. And somewhere in museum vaults across the world, clay tablets wait, fired hard, inscribed clearly, preserving claims that changed how civilizations understood the source of legitimate authority, perhaps waiting for the civilization that will finally understand what the Sumerians so carefully preserved, or perhaps satisfied that the transmission succeeded. The knowledge reached you, the patterns were recognized, the questions were raised, and that was always the purpose of the knowledge keepers, not to force belief, not to prove claims, but to transmit faithfully, trust the pattern, and let each generation decide what the evidence means. The evidence is before you, the pattern is clear, the implications are vast, the choice is yours. Sleep well. The cosmic office continues, whether or not we recognize it. The ancient patterns persist, whether or not we implement them. The knowledge waits, preserved in clay and stone, for those who remember how to read it. The Sumerians would be satisfied. They preserved their knowledge. They transmitted their questions. They built systems that outlasted their civilization. And somewhere in the quiet dark, the office of kingship remembers. Not waiting for new kings, perhaps, but waiting for someone to understand what kingship was supposed to be, what it descended from, what it preserved, what it transmitted. After the kingship descended from heaven, the claim remains, the question remains, the possibility remains. Rest in it.